Adventures of Harry Nile.
Chapter 1. The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it stalks you. It hangs in the air like a bad memory, soaking into your coat before you even realize you're wet, working its way down into your bones until you forget what being warm ever felt like. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, 1948. The kind of Tuesday that makes a man seriously consider a career in aluminum siding, or maybe just drinking himself to death quietly before the rent comes due. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a water stain on the frosted glass of my office door. The letters printed there backward read, Harry Nile, Private Investigator. The I in investigator was peeling off, curling at the edges. It matched exactly how I felt. I had a glass of rye in my left hand, and a half-smoked Lucky Strike burning down to the filter in my right. The rye was cheap. The kind of cheap that burns on the way down and leaves a metallic taste in the back of your throat, like copper pennies and old regrets. The cigarette was just a habit I couldn't afford to keep, but lacked the moral fortitude to quit. The neon sign from the chop suey joint across the street was blinking on and off, throwing a sickly red rhythm across the walls of my office. It was past 6. The decent citizens of Seattle were already home, drying off next to their radiators, listening to the evening radio broadcasts and pretending the world was a safe place. I wasn't a decent citizen, and my radiator hadn't worked since the Roosevelt administration. I was about to pour myself a second round and call it a night when the shadow appeared against the frosted glass. The door opened, no knock, just the sharp click of the latch and the long agonizing squeal of hinges I kept meaning to oil. She stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the hallway. She wasn't the kind of dame who usually walked into a cheap detective agency on a Tuesday night. For one thing, her coat probably cost more than the current Blue Book value of my Plymouth. It was a deep, immaculate burgundy wool, cut sharp at the shoulders, shedding the damp city air like it had a personal vendetta against the Pacific Northwest. Beneath the coat, she wore a silk dress in a shade of midnight blue that caught the red neon from the street and made her look like she was softly glowing. Her hat was a small, aggressively angled piece of dark felt, complete with a sheer veil that didn't quite hide her eyes. They were green. Ice green. The kind of green you see on the edge of a deep-water glacier right before you lose your footing and fall in. "Harry Nile?" she asked. Her voice was smooth, trained, and utterly devoid of warmth. It didn't belong in a room that smelled like old paper, stale tobacco, and cheap booze. "That's what it says on the door," I said, not moving from my chair. "Assuming you read it from the hallway and not from here. Take a seat, lady, or don't, but close the door. You're letting the gloom out." She shut the door with a quiet click and walked across the scuffed linoleum. She moved with the deliberate, heavy grace of someone who was used to people getting out of her way. She stopped at the edge of my desk, looking down at the scarred wood, the overflowing ashtray, and the glass of rye. She didn't look impressed. Then again, neither was I. "My name is Evelyn Thorne," she said, finally taking the hard wooden chair opposite my desk. She didn't offer a hand to shake, just a name, dropped onto my desk like a subpoena. "Miss Thorne, or is it Mrs.? Mrs., but my husband isn't the reason I'm here, not directly." She reached into a small, elegant clutch purse and pulled out a gold cigarette case. It caught the dim light, heavy and expensive. She opened it, selected a slender cigarette, and placed it between her lips. She didn't make a move to light it, she just waited. I sighed, struck a wooden match against the underside of my desk, and leaned across the expanse of cluttered paperwork to light it for her. She took a slow drag, the cherry flaring bright red, and exhaled a thin, precise stream of gray smoke toward the ceiling. The smell of her perfume hit me then, gardenia, mixed with the sharp scent of cold cash and quiet desperation. It was a dangerous combination. "So," I said, leaning back and resting my hands on my stomach, "if Mr. Thorne isn't the problem, what is? Blackmail? A missing heirloom? Or did your lapdog run away with the milkman?" Her eyes narrowed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 5 degrees. "I am not here to be entertained by your dime store wit, Mr. Nile. I am here because I was told you are discreet. I was also told you are cheap, and that you do not ask unnecessary questions. 2 out of 3 isn't bad," I muttered, taking a sip of the rye. "I'm discreet, and I'm cheap. But questions are part of the service. You don't want questions, you want a thug. I charge extra for thuggery. $50 a day, plus expenses. What's the job, Mrs. Thorne? She took another slow drag of her cigarette. I need you to find a ledger. A black leather book, roughly the size of a standard piece of stationery. It belongs to my husband's business partner, Marcus Sterling. Sterling, I tasted the name. Sterling Shipping, down on Pier 70. They move a lot of freight to Alaska. Canned fish, heavy machinery. Rumor says they move a few things that aren't on the official manifest, too. Evelyn Thorne didn't blink. I don't care about rumors, Mr. Nile. I care about that ledger. Marcus keeps the private accounts in it, the working capital that doesn't get reported to the revenue boys in Washington. He guards it with his life, and I take it Marcus has misplaced this very important book? Marcus has misplaced himself, she said smoothly. He hasn't been seen in 4 days. He did not attend Friday's board meeting. He did not return to the office Monday. My husband Richard is a trusting fool. He thinks Marcus is at a sanitarium in upstate Washington, drying out from a bender. He thinks the ledger is locked in the company's safe. But you know better. I always know better, Mr. Nile. The safe is empty. I checked it myself yesterday evening, and Marcus isn't drying out. He's running. He took the book, and he took nearly $50,000 in cash from the company reserves. I whistled low, a sound that got lost in the drumming of the rain against the glass. 50 grand in 1948 was enough money to disappear forever. You could buy a new name, a new face, and a beachfront house in Mexico, with enough left over to bribe the local federales for the rest of your natural life. If he stole 50 grand in the company's secrets, why come to me? I asked, putting my glass down. Why not go to the cops? They have badges, squad cars, and a much better heating system than I do. Because the ledger contains names, she said, leaning forward, lowering her voice. Important names, city councilmen, port authority officials. If that book ends up in the hands of the police, my husband goes to prison for a very long time. Sterling Shipping gets dismantled. I lost everything. So you want me to find Sterling, get the book, and what? Bring it back to you? What about 50 grand? Keep it, she said. She didn't hesitate. Or split it with Marcus, for all I care. I just want the black book, Mr. Nile. I want the leverage back in my house, where it belongs. I have no interest in the cash. It sounded too simple. It always sounds too simple when they're sitting in your office, looking like $1 million and offering you a piece of a pie that hasn't been baked yet. I watched her face. She was calm, too calm. A woman whose husband is facing ruin usually has the decency to wring her hands or shed a tear. Evelyn Thorne was sitting there like she was negotiating the price of a winter coat. Where did Sterling live? I asked, pulling a legal pad toward me and uncapping my fountain pen. I have no idea, she lied smoothly. I never associated with the man outside of company functions. He was vulgar. He preferred the company of longshoremen and cheap women. You might start at the docks. That was his element. I stopped writing and looked at her. You have no idea where your husband's business partner of 10 years lived? I am a busy woman, Mr. Nile. I don't keep track of the hired help. She shifted in her chair, opening her clutch purse again to retrieve her cigarette case. As she did, something caught the edge of the fabric and tumbled out, landing on my desk with a soft cardboard patter. It was a matchbook. Evelyn Thorne's perfectly manicured hand shot out to grab it, but I was faster. I scooped it in my palm. The cover was damp, slightly curled at the edges. It was printed with the logo of a mermaid holding a harpoon. Text read, "The Rusty Anchor, Pier 52, Finest Ales and Spirits." Pier 52, I read aloud, rolling the matchbook between my fingers. That's a long way from the Sterling Shipping offices on Pier 70. And it's a very long way from whatever polite neighborhood you live in, Mrs. Thorne. Her jaw tightened, just a fraction of an inch, but I saw it. The ice-green eyes lost a bit of their composure. It must have been in my coat pocket, a mistake from the dry cleaner. Sure, I said, tossing the matchbook back onto the desk. Dry cleaners are notorious for frequenting dive bars on the waterfront and leaving their souvenirs in high-end burgundy wool coats. It's an epidemic in this city. She didn't laugh. She reached into her purse again, this time pulling out a thick manila envelope. She tossed it onto the desk next to the matchbook. It hit the wood with a heavy, satisfying thud. "There is $200 in that envelope, Mr. Nile. Consider it a retainer. Find the ledger. Bring it to me. Do not involve the police, and do not speak to my husband. When you have the book, call this number." She slid a small cream-colored calling card across the desk. It had a phone number printed on it, nothing else. "50 a day, plus expenses," I reminded her, picking up the envelope. I thumbed it open. It was full of crisp $20 bills. They didn't smell like gardenias. They smelled like a bank vault. "Just find the book," she said, standing. She didn't say goodbye. She just turned on her heel and walked out the door, leaving the scent of perfume and the faint echo of a lie hanging in the stale air. I sat there for a long time, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. I looked at the matchbook. I looked at the money. A smart man would have returned the money. But my rent was 3 weeks past due. My shoes had holes in the soles, and being smart had never really been my strong suit anyway. The door to the inner office opened. Jolene walked in. She was my secretary, my answering service, and occasionally my conscience. She was a tough broad from the south side of Chicago, who had ended up in Seattle looking for a fresh start, only to find that the rain here washed away everything except your past. She had a pencil tucked behind her ear and a stack of unpaid bills in one hand. "I heard the door," Jolene said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked at the envelope of cash, then at the half-empty bottle of rye. "Tell me you didn't just take a job from a woman who smells like expensive trouble." "I took a job from a woman who smells like gardenias and cold hard cash, Joe," I said, slipping the envelope into my inner jacket pocket. "She's looking for a book." "A book?" Jolene raised an eyebrow. "What is it, an overdue library copy of Moby Dick?" "Let me guess, she offered you too much money to do something incredibly stupid. $200 up front, and I'm going to earn every nickel of it." I picked up the matchbook and tossed it to her. She caught it cleanly with one hand. "Run that name down for me tomorrow morning. The Rusty Anchor on Pier 52. See if Marcus Sterling had a tab there, or a regular bar stool." "Marcus Sterling?" Jolene frowned, looking at the matchbook. "The shipping guy? Harry? He's a heavy hitter. He runs with a rough crowd on the docks. The kind of crowd that uses lead pipes to settle union disputes." "He's also missing," I said, standing up and grabbing my trench coat from the hat rack. The coat was still wet from this morning. I pulled it on, shivering as the damp fabric settled against my shoulders. "And his lovely business partner's wife wants to find him. Or rather, she wants to find the little black book he took with him." "And where are you going at this hour?" Jolene asked, crossing her arms. "It's pouring out there. You look like you're about to catch pneumonia." "I'm going to get a drink," I said, pulling my fedora down low over my eyes, "at a place where the dry cleaners apparently like to hang out." I walked past her, out the door, and down the dark, creaking stairs of the building. The street hit me like a wet slap. The Seattle rain was coming down harder now, washing the grime of the day into the gutters. But it would take more than rain to wash this city clean. I lit another Lucky Strike, turned up my collar against the wind, and started walking toward the waterfront. The case had walked in. Now, the real work was about to begin. Chapter 2. The fog rolled off Puget Sound like a bad debt you couldn't outrun. It wasn't raining, but the air was so heavy with moisture and sea salt that you could wring it out with your bare hands. It choked the street lamps down to weak, hazy halos and swallowed the sounds of the city, turning the rattle of a distant streetcar into a muffled groan. Down on the waterfront, the fog was absolute boss. It erased the ships at anchor, erased the horizon, and left only the slick, oily planks of the piers and the smell of diesel, dead fish, and desperation. I walked south along Alaskan Way, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my trench coat. The cold was a living thing down here, gnawing at my ankles and creeping up my spine. This was the working edge of Seattle, a place built on heavy lifting and short tempers, where a man could lose his paycheck in an hour and his life in a minute if he stepped into the wrong alley. Pier 52 loomed out of the gray soup, a massive wooden structure stretching out into the black water. The Rusty Anchor wasn't hard to find. It was the only joint on the pier that didn't look like a warehouse, mostly because it had a cracked neon sign in the window that buzzed like a dying hornet. The mermaid on the sign was missing half her scales, and her harpoon was just a dark, unlit stick. But it was a beacon for every thirsty longshoreman and busted sailor within a mile. I pushed through the heavy oak door. The smell hit me first: stale beer, cheap cigars, and the sharp tang of sweat. The place was a cavern of dark wood and low ceilings, lit by caged bulbs that hung on frayed wires. The clientele consisted of men who looked like they were carved out of driftwood and bad decisions. A few heads turned my way, taking in the fedora and the coat, registering that I didn't belong. Then they returned to their drinks. Down here, minding your own business was a survival tactic. I approached the mahogany bar. It was scarred with knife marks and cigarette burns, a wooden ledger of every argument that had ever ended badly in this room. The bartender was a guy named Mickey. He was short, wide, and entirely bald, with a nose that had been broken so many times it looked like a crumpled road map. He was wiping down the counter with a rag that was probably dirtier than the wood he was cleaning. He saw me sit down, paused, and tossed the rag over his shoulder. "Nile," he said, his voice like gravel in a tin can. "You're off your beat, ain't ya? Uptown dicks don't usually slum it down here unless somebody's paying them to." "I'm not uptown, Mickey," I said, putting a silver dollar on the bar. "And I'm not slumming, just expanding my cultural horizons. Give me a Rainier in a glass that hasn't been used to clean an engine block." Mickey grunted, swept the dollar into his apron, and pulled a draft. He set the glass down in front of me with a heavy thud. Foam spilled over the edge, cutting a clean path through the grime on the bar. "Drink up and move along, Harry," Mickey muttered, leaning in close. His breath smelled of pickled eggs and chewing tobacco. "Boys in here don't like Snoops, and you got Snoop written all over that cheap suit of yours." I bought it on sale. I took a pull of the beer. It was cold and bitter, exactly what I needed. And I'm just looking for a friend, a guy who might have left a piece of his property behind. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the damp matchbook with the harpoon-wielding mermaid, and dropped it on the bar. Mickey looked at it. His eyes flickered, just for a second, but a second is all you need if you're watching close. He picked up his dirty rag and started aggressively wiping a spot a foot away from the matchbook. "We give those away by the handful," Mickey said, not looking at me. "Means nothing." "It means he was here," I said softly, keeping my voice under the rumble of the jukebox in the corner. "Marcus Sterling, big guy, nice clothes, probably stuck out in here worse than I do." Mickey kept wiping. "Don't know the name, don't know the face. Lots of guys come through here, Harry. Don't play dumb, Mick. It doesn't suit your refined intellectual character." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the sticky mahogany. "Sterling Shipping is right down the street. He's the boss, and I know he was here recently, so let's skip the amnesia routine. You owe me." Mickey stopped wiping. He gripped the edge of the bar, his knuckles turning white. "I don't owe you anything, Nile. 2 years ago," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "your kid brother, Tommy, whoever thought he could run a numbers racket out of a candy store in Belltown, he got in deep with some very unfriendly Italians. I was the one who found him hiding in that crawl space before they did. I bought him a bus ticket to Portland and told the Italians he went to Chicago. You swore up and down you'd owe me your right arm for that." Mickey swallowed hard. The thick muscles in his neck jumped. He looked around the bar, making sure nobody was listening. The longshoremen were busy arguing over a boxing match, oblivious to us. "I still have my right arm," Mickey growled softly. "I'd like to keep it. People asking about Sterling lately have a bad habit of ending up in the Sound with cinder blocks for shoes. Word on the docks is he crossed somebody big. I'm not looking to cross anybody. I'm just looking for a book he took with him. Now, when was he in here?" Mickey let out a heavy sigh, defeated. He wiped a hand across his bald head. "Friday night, late, past midnight. He came in through the back alley door, not the front. It looked like hell. He was shaking, Harry. A guy like Marcus Sterling, he doesn't shake. He usually walks here like he owns the ocean. But Friday, he was jumpy, kept looking at the door, sweating through his expensive shirt. Was he drinking?" Mick leaned, straight gin. Threw 3 of them in 10 minutes. But he wasn't here to get blind. He was waiting. "For who?" "Another guy." Mickey leaned in closer. Didn't get a good look at him. Skinny, wore a gray fedora pulled down low and a tan raincoat, but I noticed his hands when he lit a cigarette. The left hand was missing the pinky and ring finger. A 2-fingered man. I filed that detail away. 2 missing fingers isn't something you forget. They talk, quietly, just a few words. Sterling slid a thick envelope across the table. It looked like cash. The skinny guy took it, nodded, and walked out. Sterling stayed for a few minutes, breathing heavy, like he just ran a marathon. Then he paid his tab, left a $5 tip, and went out the front. Dropped his matches on the way out, I guess. Did he have a package with him? A briefcase? A black leather book? He had a briefcase. Mickey nodded slowly. Brown leather, locked tight, clutched it to his chest like a newborn baby. "Thanks, Mick," I said, finishing my beer and standing up. "You keep your right arm, we're square." "Watch your back, Harry," Mickey shouted as I turned away. "Whatever Sterling is mixed up in, it ain't the kind of mud that washes off." I walked out the front door and let the fog swallow me again. Friday night, Sterling meets a two-fingered man, hands over an envelope of cash, and walks out clutching a briefcase. That didn't sound like a man skipping town with company funds. That sounded like a man paying off a blackmailer, or buy a ticket from a very deep hole. I needed to know where he went after he left the bar. I walked around to the side of the building, toward the narrow alley that ran behind the pier warehouses. It was darker back here, the air smelling strongly of rotting kelp and spilled gasoline. There was a rusted-out trash can near the back exit of the Rusty Anchor, and leaning against the brick wall beside it was a man smoking a pipe. He wore a faded tweed cap and a heavy wool sweater. Next to him, parked half on the sidewalk, was a battered yellow checker cab. "Hey, Sully," I shouted, my footsteps echoing off the wet brick. The man took the pipe out of his mouth and squinted into the fog. "Harry Nile. I'd ask what brings you down to the gutter, but you always look like you belong here anyway." Sully was a permanent fixture on the waterfront. He drove a hack by night and slept during the day, maintaining a vast, encyclopedic knowledge of everyone who came and went along Alaskan Way. He heard everything, saw everything, and forgot nothing, provided the price was right. "I need a memory retrieved, Sully," I said, walking up to him. I pulled a $5 bill from my pocket and folded it in half. Friday night, late, past midnight. A big guy in a nice suit comes out of the Anchor, carrying a brown leather briefcase. Sully stared at the $5 bill. He didn't reach for it. "Lots of guys in suits, Harry." I added another 5, folding them together. $10 was a week's groceries. Sully reached out with 2 fingers and slid the bills out of my hand, making them vanish into his sweater with the skill of a stage magician. "Yeah, I remember him," Sully said, puffing on his pipe. The sweet smell of cherry tobacco cut through the diesel fumes. "He didn't want to wait for a radio dispatch. Flagged me down right here." The man was in a hurry, kept tapping his shiny shoes on the floorboards, telling me to step on it. "Where did you take him?" He asked for the King Street station. Figured him for a guy catching the red-eye down to Portland or Frisco. But when we pulled up to the station, he didn't get out. Changed his mind? "More like he got spooked," Sully said, knocking his pipe against the brick wall to clear the ashes. We were sitting at the curb, and a black Packard sedan rolled slowly past the station entrance. 2 guys inside. They weren't cops. Sterling took one look at that Packard, ducked down in the back seat, and told me to keep driving. "Where to?" "Just drove in circles for 20 minutes. Pioneer Square, Chinatown, through Yesler Way. Finally, he told me to drop him in the alley behind the Barclay Hotel. Handed me a 20 and told me to keep my mouth shut." Sully looked at me, unapologetic. "But $20 only buys a couple days of silence, Harry. Inflation, you know." "The Barclay," I muttered. It was a crumbling residential hotel on the edge of the International District. The kind of place that rented rooms by the hour, the day, or the month, and didn't ask for a real name in the registry. It was a perfect place to hide if you had enemies, and Marcus Sterling clearly had enemies. "Thanks, Sully," I said. "Don't mention it. And Harry." Sully pointed the stem of his pipe at me. "The guy in the Packard, the driver." I caught his face in the streetlights when he rolled past the station. Flat nose, bad complexion, looked like Joey the Shiv Russo. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. Joey Russo was a local syndicate muscle. If the mob was looking for Sterling, this wasn't just a corporate embezzlement case anymore. The stakes had just been raised from $50,000 to life and death. I turned away from the cab and started walking back toward the street. The fog was thicker now, pressing in from all sides. I was so caught up in the math of Joey Russo, Marcus Sterling, and the missing ledger that I didn't see the shadow detach itself from the alley wall until it was too late. A heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder, spinning me around. Before I could reach for the .38 special holstered under my arm, I was shoved hard against the damp brick wall. "Going somewhere in a hurry, Harry?" The voice was deep, rough, and entirely familiar. I blinked through the gloom and recognized the square jaw, the broken nose, and the tired, bloodshot eyes of Detective Frank Rossi, Seattle Police Department. Rossi and I went back. We'd shared a foxhole on Guadalcanal, traded cigarettes for rice, and bled on the same patch of miserable jungle dirt. He went into the force. I went private. We had a mutual respect, heavily layered with mutual irritation. "Frank," I coughed, adjusting my collar where he'd grabbed me. "You're getting aggressive in your old age. You want a hug, just ask." Rossi didn't smile. He stepped back, keeping his hand near the butt of his service revolver. He wore a rumpled gray suit that looked like he'd slept in it for a week, and a fedora that had seen better decades. "What are you sniffing around the waterfront, Harry?" Rossi demanded. "And don't give me a song and dance. I saw you talking to Mickey. I saw you pay off Sully." "I'm looking for a lost dog," I lied effortlessly. "Brown fur, answers to the name of Rover. Thought maybe he wandered down to the piers to chase seagulls." "Cut the crap," Rossi snapped. He leaned in, and I could smell the stale coffee and exhaustion radiating off him. "You're looking into Marcus Sterling. Don't bother denying it." I stayed quiet. Letting the cops do the talking is usually the best defense. "Sterling shipping is hot, Harry," Rossi continued, lowering his voice. "Vice and rackets have been building a case on him for 6 months. Smuggling, kickbacks, union intimidation. We were going to bust him and the whole operation wide open this week, but on Friday he vanished." "Sounds like you boys fumbled the ball," I said smoothly. "He got a tip," Rossi growled. "Somebody inside the department warned him. He cleaned his private safe and bolted. We've got uniforms turning this city upside down looking for him. If you know where he is, Nile, you need to spit it out. Obstructing a racketeering investigation carries a heavy bit of time in Walla Walla." I reached into my pocket, slowly, telegraphing the movement so Rossi wouldn't get jumpy, and pulled out a cigarette. I lit it, the match flaring brightly in the alleyway. "I don't know where he is, Frank," I said, exhaling the smoke. It was the truth, mostly. "I'm just working on a private contract, recovering some stolen property." "The ledger," Rossi said instantly. I didn't flinch, but I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. The cops knew the black book. Evelyn Thorne had told me the book contained names that would ruin her husband, but if Vice was after it, it contained enough dynamite to level half of Seattle's political machine. "I'm just a guy trying to pay rent, Frank," I said softly. "Walk away, Harry," Rossi warned, his eyes dark and serious. "This isn't a jealous husband or a missing necklace. You step into the middle of this, you're going to get crushed. The mob wants Sterling. We want Sterling. If you get to him first, neither side is going to ask questions before they start shooting." "I'll keep my head down," I promised, flicking the ash from my cigarette onto the wet pavement. Rossi stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head in disgust. "You never could walk away from a bad bet, Nile. Just remember I warned you. Next time I see you, I might not be so friendly." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog like a ghost. I stood in the alley alone for a minute, listening to the drip of water from the fire escapes, the mob, the cops, a two-fingered man, and a wife who was far too calm about losing 50 grand. Evelyn Thorne had lied to me. She wasn't just trying to save her husband from a scandal. She was trying to get her hands on the biggest extortion file in the Pacific Northwest before the syndicate or the police did. I took one last drag of my cigarette, flicked the butt into a muddy puddle, and walked out of the alley. I knew where I had to go. The Barclay Hotel was waiting. And I had a feeling that Marcus Sterling, or whatever was left of him, was waiting there too. The streets had talked. Now it was time to see if they were telling the truth. Chapter 3. The Barclay Hotel smelled like a combination of floor wax, cabbage soup, and institutional neglect. It stood on a gloomy stretch of Jackson Street, wedged between a pawn shop that looked like it hadn't seen a customer since the Depression, and a boarded-up laundry. The lobby was a masterclass in beige despair, a cracked linoleum floor that had long forgotten what wax felt like, a couple of heavy vinyl chairs with stuffing spilling out like old guts, and a scarred wooden registration desk behind a brass wire mesh that looked sturdy enough to stop a bullet, or at least a very angry drunk. The night clerk was a man who looked like he'd been pressed between the pages of an old ledger and forgotten about for 40 years. He wore a yellowed undershirt, sleeve garters, and wire-rimmed glasses held together with black electrician's tape at the bridge. He was listening to a low-frequency baseball game on a battered Emerson radio that crackled with static every time a streetcar rumbled past outside. I walked up to the wire mesh and tapped my fingernails against it. Tap, tap, tap. The clerk didn't look up right away. He waited until the radio announcer finished calling a foul ball before slowly sliding his rheumy eyes up to meet mine. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me with the vacant expression of a man who had seen every species of human wreckage crawl through his front door and had stopped caring about the taxonomy years ago. "Evening, sport," I said, leaning my forearms against the counter. "I'm looking for my friend, Marcus. Goes by Mark. A bit tall, wears a sharp gray suit, probably looks like he's having a very bad week." The clerk reached out, turned the radio volume down a fraction, and rasped, "We don't keep tabs on guests' moods here, mister. We keep tabs on rent. Paid in advance, cash preferred, no questions asked." "You got rent?" I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill from the retainer Evelyn Thorne had handed over so generously, and slid it under the wire mesh. It landed right next to an overflowing ashtray full of Pall Mall butts. "I don't need a room," I said, keeping my voice low and smooth. "I just need to know if Mark is staying in 412, or maybe 314, somewhere up high enough to catch the view of the railroad tracks." The clerk looked at the 20. His eyes drifted from the bill to my face, then back to the bill. With a thumb that looked like a dried apricot, he slid the greenback under a blotter. "Room 414, the clerk muttered. "Top floor, rear corner, faces the brick wall of the warehouse, so don't expect much of a sunset, and he ain't taking visitors, not unless they're carrying a sandwich or a shovel." "What makes you say that?" "He hasn't come out since he checked in Saturday morning," the clerk said, leaning back in his creaking wooden swivel chair. "Didn't order room service, didn't ask for ice. The only reason I know he's still breathing is I heard him coughing around noon today. Sounded like a wet sponge hitting the floor. If you're going up there, make it quick. The management doesn't like guests dying on the premises. Too much paperwork for the coroner." "Appreciate the tip," I said, turning away from the desk. "Hey," the clerk yelled before I reached the stairs. I glanced back. "If he's dead, leave his watch. Standard hotel policy." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. The staircase was a narrow wooden spiral that smelled strongly of old wet wool and cheap disinfectant. Every step groaned under my weight like it was filing a formal grievance with the city council. The fourth-floor hallway was pitch black except for a single amber bulb hanging from a frayed cord overhead, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling floral wallpaper. Room 414 was at the very end of the hall, tucked into a dark alcove where the draft from a loose window frame whistled a low, mournful tune. I stopped outside the door. I stood there for a moment, listening. Silence. No radio, no footsteps. Just the distant rumble of a truck down on 4th Avenue and the heavy rhythmic thud of my own heart against my ribs. I raised my right hand and rapped my knuckles gently against the cheap plywood door. Knock, knock, nothing. I waited 5 seconds and tried again, a bit louder this time. Still nothing. I gripped the brass doorknob. I didn't really expect it to turn. A guy hiding from the mob, and the cops usually has the good sense to throw a deadbolt. I gave it a twist anyway. It turned. The latch slid back with a soft, expensive-sounding click. That was my first warning sign. A man on the run doesn't leave his door unlocked, especially not in a flophouse like the Barclay, where the locks could be picked with a bent paperclip and a mild lack of morals. I drew my .38 Special from its shoulder holster, keeping the barrel pointed down toward the floorboards, and pushed the door open with my left hand. The room was pitch black. A thick wall of stale air rolled out into the hallway, a suffocating cocktail of cheap bourbon, unwashed linen, stale cigarette smoke, and the unmistakable copper-heavy tang of fresh blood. It's a smell that gets into the back of your throat and stays there, clinging to your teeth like a bad meal. I reached inside the doorframe, sweeping my hand along the wall until my fingers brushed against a cold metal toggle switch. I flicked it up. A single naked bulb hanging from a twisted cord overhead sputtered to life, swaying back and forth and casting frantic, dizzy circles of yellow light across the room. The room wasn't large. A sagging iron frame bed with a stained gray mattress, a small oak dresser with a cracked mirror, a metal wastebasket overflowing with empty gin bottles and crumpled telegrams, and a single wooden chair pushed against the baseboard, and sitting in that wooden chair was Marcus Sterling. At least what was left of him. He was slumped forward at an unnatural angle, his head resting heavily against the edge of the dresser. He was still wearing the expensive gray wool suit Evelyn Thorne had described, but the jacket was torn at the shoulder and soaked dark with blood around the ribs. His tie was loose, hanging like a dead snake around his collar. His skin had the pale, waxy look of a department store mannequin that had been left too close to a radiator. I stepped into the room, kicking the door shut behind me with my heel, and locked the deadbolt. You don't want an audience walking in on a dead body, especially when you're standing 5 feet away from it with a smoking hot suspicion and a gun in your hand. I holstered the .38 and walked over to the chair. I didn't touch him. That's a good way to get your fingerprints registered with the Homicide Bureau on terms you won't like. But I leaned down to get a closer look. There was a hole in his chest, right through the lapel of his fine Italian wool suit. Small caliber, clean entry, messy exit. Shot close range, probably pressed right against his coat so the noise wouldn't carry through the thin walls to the next room. "Well, Mark," I whispered to the empty room, "looks like you reached the end of the line before the conductor even punched your ticket." I scanned the room, letting my eyes pick up the details the police would tear apart in 20 minutes. On the dresser, right next to a glass with a few inches of warm water and melted ice at the bottom, was a silver Zippo lighter, engraved with the initials MS. Next to the Zippo was a pack of Camels, mostly crushed, and a leather wallet spilled open on the wood. I leaned in and checked the contents without touching the leather. Driver's license issued by the state of Washington, business cards for Sterling Shipping, a couple of 5s, a 10, and a picture of a smiling woman with dark hair who didn't look anything like Evelyn Thorne. But what caught my eye wasn't on the dresser. It was on the floor, half hidden beneath the iron frame of the bed, a corner of dark brown leather. I crouched down, ignoring the protest of my knees, and reached under the bed. I hooked my fingers around the handle and pulled it out into the light. It was a heavy, leather-bound briefcase. The brass latches were unclipped. My breath caught in my throat. This was it, the prize Evelyn Thorne had sent me out into the rain to find. The black box of secrets that had cost Marcus Sterling his life. I flipped the latches open and threw the lid back. Inside, neatly stacked, were hundreds of pages of financial ledgers, columns of figures written out in precise, old-fashioned black ink, recording shipping manifests, payroll kickbacks, payoffs to municipal inspectors, and numbered bank accounts in Zurich and Vancouver. I reached inside, picked up the topmost ledger, and flipped through the pages. The names were right there, scrawled in black and white: city councilmen, port commissioners, syndicate bosses. It was a roadmap to corruption, spanning 5 years of payoffs and protection rackets. And right there, clipped to the inside cover with a rusty paperclip, was a bank deposit slip for $50,000, dated 4 days ago, made out to an account under the name Richard Thorne. Richard Thorne, Evelyn's husband. The trusting fool who thought his partner was just drying out at a sanitarium. The puzzle pieces slammed into place so hard my teeth rattled. Marcus Sterling hadn't stolen the money from the company to run away to Mexico. He had been holding the evidence against Richard Thorne. He had been the bookkeeper who kept the records of the boss's dirty dealings. And when Richard decided he wanted out, or wanted the whole operation for himself, he sent someone to clean the ledger and close the account permanently. Evelyn hadn't hired me to find a missing partner. She had hired me to find the incriminating evidence before the police did, or worse, to frame me for the murder if things went sideways. If I walked out of this room with the briefcase, my fingerprints would be all over the handle. The murder weapon would probably be planted in my coat pocket before I hit the lobby, and the cops would have a nice, neat, closed case wrapped in a cheap brown bow. "Nicely played, Mrs. Thorne," I muttered to the empty room. "You almost had me buying the whole innocent wife routine." Then, from the hallway, I heard it, a soft, deliberate scuff of shoe leather against the linoleum floor outside room 414. Not the heavy, dragging step of the night clerk, not the erratic shuffle of a passing vagrant. It was a careful, measured step. The kind of step made by a professional who knew how to approach a closed door without announcing his arrival. I froze. My hand dropped instantly to the butt of my .38 Special, my fingers wrapping around the checkered wood grip. The shadow beneath the crack at the bottom of the door shifted. Someone was standing on the other side. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to wonder how they found me so fast. I grabbed the leather briefcase with my left hand, jammed it under my arm, and backed away from the body toward the small, grime-caked window that looked out onto the brick wall of the warehouse across the alley. The doorknob turned. The deadbolt held for a fraction of a second, the heavy steel tongue grinding against the wooden frame with a sharp, protesting screech. Then, with a sudden, violent crack, the entire lock assembly splintered out of the rotting wood. The door swung wide open. A man stepped into the room. He wore a tan raincoat with the collar turned up high, and a gray fedora pulled down so low I couldn't see his eyes. But I didn't need to see his eyes. I saw his left hand as he reached inside his coat to pull a nickel-plated automatic. The pinky and ring fingers were completely gone. A clean, smooth stump where the digits should have been. The two-fingered man from the Rusty Anchor. The man who had collected Marcus Sterling's envelope of cash Friday night. He saw Marcus Sterling's corpse slumped against the dresser. Then his head snapped around, fixing those cold, dead eyes directly on me. "Drop the bag, Nile," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "And let's have a little chat about what you found." I didn't drop the bag, and I sure as hell wasn't planning on having a chat. I pulled the .38 from my holster, raised it over the top of the briefcase, and let the room explode in a flash of orange fire and deafening noise. The game was officially over. Now it was just about who left the Barclay Hotel on their own 2 feet. Chapter 4. The first shot didn't hit a damn thing except a framed portrait of Calvin Coolidge hanging on the faded wallpaper, blowing a neat hole right through the 30th president's forehead and sending a flurry of dry plaster dust cascading down onto the floorboards. That was all the warning the two-fingered man needed. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, and didn't waste time reading poetry. He dropped his shoulder, stepped back into the shadow of the doorframe, and hammered a round of his own into the room. The slug chewed through the cheap wooden molding a fraction of an inch above my right ear, spraying wood splinters across my cheek that stung like a handful of thrown gravel. I hit the floor, sliding on a layer of grit and empty gin bottles, using the sagging iron frame bed as a clumsy barricade. The heavy leather briefcase was clutched tightly under my left arm like a football in a muddy stadium game. "You're making a mistake, friend," I shouted over the ringing in my ears, pressing my back flat against the peeling wallpaper beneath the bed frame. "Unless you enjoy talking to homicide cops, because half the department is already looking for this book. The only thing I enjoy is a clean kill, Nile." His voice scraped back from the hallway, cold and flat, unbothered by the gunfire or the thin walls. "And you're cluttering up my scenery." Footsteps retreated down the hall, fast, light, and purposeful. No heavy running, just the calculated stride of a man who knew when the odds shifted and when it was time to live to shoot another day. I waited 5 seconds, counting the steady drip of a leaky pipe somewhere inside the wall, before I risked lifting my head. The hallway was empty. The amber bulb overhead buzzed, swinging slightly on its frayed wire, casting long, nervous shivers across the blood-soaked floor and the ruined doorway. I scrambled to my feet, keeping the .38 Special loose and ready in my grip, and walked over to the shattered frame. I kicked the splintered wood aside and peered down the corridor. Nothing. Just the dark, winding mouth of the stairwell and the smell of cordite mixing with the stale hotel cabbage. The two-fingered man was gone, melted back into the wet Seattle night before I could even get a clean look at his face. But he left something in the air, aside from the stink of burned gunpowder and cheap tobacco. He left a question. If the two-fingered man was working for the mob, or if he was the one who put a bullet through Marcus Sterling's ribs, what was he doing back at the Barclay Hotel less than 10 minutes after I arrived? Nobody knew I was coming here except me, Sully the cabbie, and the half-blind night clerk downstairs. Unless somebody else had tipped him off. Unless someone was watching every move I made from the moment I stepped out of my office. I looked down at the heavy leather briefcase tucked under my arm. The black book of secrets, the payroll kickbacks, and the $50,000 bank deposit slip made out to Richard Thorne. I returned to the dead man in the chair. Marcus Sterling looked even paler under the flickering light. his lifeless eyes staring vacantly at the opposite wall as if he were trying to read a billboard in a fog. I didn't feel sorry for him. A man who spends years keeping ledgers for crooks and murderers usually ends up balancing the books with his own blood. It's simple arithmetic. But as I stood there, looking down at his tailored gray suit and the neat small caliber entry wound through his lapel, something started to itch at the back of my brain. A tiny, insignificant detail that didn't fit into the neat little equation Evelyn Thorne had handed over on a silver platter in my office. I knelt down beside the chair, ignoring the stale stench of death, and took a closer look at the dead man's hands. Marcus Sterling's fingers were long, clean, and manicured. The nails were clipped short and neat, the skin smooth. The hands of a man who sat behind a mahogany desk, pushed papers around, and let other people do the heavy lifting down on the docks. Then I looked at his cuffs. The left sleeve of his expensive Italian wool jacket was pulled back just a fraction of an inch, revealing a silver wristwatch with a brown leather strap. Next to the watch strap, right on the inside of his wrist, was a faint, jagged white scar about 2 inches long, an old burn or a deep cut that had healed over years ago. I stood up slowly, the gears turning in my head with a dry metallic squeak. I thought about what Mickey the bartender had said down at the Rusty Anchor. He was shaking, Harry. A guy like Marcus Sterling, he doesn't shake. Kept looking at the door, sweating through his expensive shirt. I thought about what Sully the cabbie had said. He flagged me down. The man was in a hurry. Kept tapping his shiny shoes on the floorboards, telling me to step on it. And then I thought about the man Evelyn Thorne had described in my office just a few hours ago. Marcus keeps the private accounts in it. He hasn't been seen in 4 days. He's running. 3 different people describing the exact same man, but none of them matched the physical reality sitting in that wooden chair. I reached down and picked up the dead man's wallet from the dresser. I flipped it open, pulled out the Washington State driver's license, and held it under the dim yellow light of the hanging bulb. The name printed on the card was Marcus Sterling. The address was a high-end residential building on Queen Anne Hill. The birth date made him 42. I stared at the photograph on the license. The face in the picture had a slightly wider nose, a different slope to the jawline, and ears that pinned back closer to the skull than the man sitting dead in front of me. It was a good fake, the kind of high-grade forgery you could only buy if you had connections deep inside the State Department of Licenses, or a crooked printer down in the International District. The man in the chair wasn't Marcus Sterling. I slammed the wallet shut and tossed it back onto the dresser. The realization hit me with the force of a wet right hook to the jaw. Marcus Sterling hadn't been murdered here in room 414 Saturday morning. The real Marcus Sterling was probably sitting on a beach in Mexico right now, sipping a cold drink and laughing his ass off while $50,000 of company funds kept him warm in the sun. The poor bastard sitting in this chair, the guy with the tailored suit, the fake ID, and the bullet hole in his chest, wasn't the boss at all. He was the fall guy. A decoy hired to look like Sterling, checked into a Fleabag hotel, and drew the heat away while the real boss cleared out the bank accounts and skipped the country. Meaning Evelyn Thorne knew her business partner wasn't dead 4 days ago. She knew he was running, or at least she knew someone was playing a very expensive game of hide and seek. And she didn't hire me to find a missing partner or recover a lost ledger. She hired me to walk into a trap, find a dead decoy, get my fingerprints all over the murder weapon and the briefcase, and take the fall for a homicide I didn't commit. You're a cold piece of work, Mrs. Thorne, I whispered, lighting a fresh Lucky Strike with hands that were only shaking a little bit. You wanted a patsy with a cheap office and a bad credit rating, and you picked the top of the line. I needed answers, and I needed them before Detective Frank Rossi or the two-fingered man caught up with me in a dark alley with my name written on a tombstone. I grabbed the heavy leather briefcase, tucked it securely under my arm, and checked the hallway one last time. It was quiet. Just the hum of the amber bulb and the drip. I slipped out of room 414, bypassed the groaning spiral staircase, and took the service exit that led down into the concrete gloom of the alleyway behind the Barclay Hotel. The rain had let up into a miserable, fine mist that coated my fedora in tiny beads of water. The wind whipped down the narrow brick canyon, carrying the smell of rotting garbage and salt water from the bay. I kept my head down, my hand resting comfortably on the butt of the .38 special in my pocket, and started walking toward 4th Avenue. I needed to talk to someone who knew the shipping business better than a couple of thugs on the docks. I needed to talk to a secretary who didn't take bribes, or a guy who handled the real paperwork while the bosses played golf at the Rainier Club. I walked 3 blocks through the empty, rain-slicked streets of the International District before I found a public telephone booth glowing with a weak yellow light outside a closed barber shop. The glass panes were smeared with grime, and the receiver felt greasy in my hand. I dropped a nickel into the slot and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang 4 times before a tired, gravelly voice picked up on the other end. "Yeah? If this is another bill collector, I'm already dead." "Save the melodrama, Jolene," I said, leaning my shoulder against the grimy glass wall of the booth. "I'm still breathing, at least for another 10 minutes. There was a short pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of typing in the background and the hum of the ancient electric heater in my office. "Thank Christ," Jolene muttered, letting out a long breath. "I was about to call the morgue and save them the trouble of looking up your dental records. Where are you?" "The phone company called an hour ago, threatening to cut the line, and some guy in a gray suit has been lurking across the street near the chop suey joint for the last 20 minutes. "A guy in a gray suit?" I asked, my grip tightening on the receiver. "What did he look like?" "Tall, thin, wearing a hat pulled down low," Jolene said, her voice dropping an octave. "And Harry? I didn't see his left hand clearly, but when he lit a match against the brick wall, I think he was missing a couple of fingers." My blood ran cold. The 2-fingered man hadn't just vanished into the fog after our shootout at the Barclay. He had followed me across town and staked out my office while I was dodging bullets in a flophouse. He was closing the net, and my office was the center of the bullseye. "Listen to me very carefully, Joe," I said, keeping my voice firm and flat. "Lock the inner office door, turn off the lights, don't open the door for anyone, not the cops, not the mailman, and sure as hell not a guy asking for directions. If anyone tries to pick the lock, you take the fire escape down to the alley and catch a cab straight to your sister's place in Ballard." "What about you, Harry?" she asked, a sudden edge of real panic cutting through her usual cynical armor. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to pay a visit to Mrs. Evelyn Thorne," I said, looking out through the smeared glass of the phone booth on the dark, dripping street. "It's time to ask her why the dead man in room 414 didn't match the description on his own driver's license." "Harry, that's insane," Jolene protested. "She's rich, she's connected, and if the mob is already involved—" "The mob is the least of my worries right now," I interrupted. "I've got a heavy leather briefcase full of dirty secrets, $50,000 in funny money, and a migraine that feels like a freight train rolling over my forehead. Stay put, Joe. I'll call you when this is over." I slammed the receiver back onto the cradle before she could argue another word. I pulled the collar of my trench coat up around my ears, stepped out of the phone booth, and started walking toward Queen Anne Hill. The rain started up again, harder this time, turning the pavement into a black, reflective mirror that shattered the neon signs into streaks of red and green. I had the briefcase under my arm, a gun in my pocket, and a target on my back the size of a billboard. But for the first time all evening, I felt like I was finally moving in the right direction. The case was opening up, and the first real lie was about to get unzipped. Chapter 5. Queen Anne Hill sits up high above the rest of Seattle, looking down like a rich uncle who won't invite you inside for Christmas dinner. The houses up there are big, old Victorians and sprawling brick colonials with manicured hedges and wraparound porches that don't know the meaning of a drafty window frame or a broken radiator. The streets are wider. The air smells less like diesel and more like wet pine and expensive cedar smoke, and the street lamps actually work without flickering like a dying match. It was past 9 o'clock by the time I reached the Thorne residence on Highland Drive. The house was a massive 3-story Tudor revival set back behind a wrought iron fence and a thick line of weeping willows that hissed in the driving rain. A single amber light burned over the heavy oak front door, and upstairs, a sliver of yellow light cut across the second-floor window curtains. Somebody was still awake, or maybe they were just waiting for a package that never arrived. I didn't use the front gate. Walking up a paved driveway with a heavy leather briefcase under your arm and a .38 special in your coat pocket is a good way to get introduced to a private security guard or a shotgun-wielding gardener named Sven. Instead, I looped around to the side, slipping through a gap in the wet private hedge that bordered the neighbor's property, and made my way across a lawn that felt like walking on a sponge. The backyard was a terrace of dark slate tiles, slick with rainwater and fallen maple leaves. I stayed close to the stone wall of the house, keeping out of the reach of the floodlights that swept the perimeter every few minutes. My shoes squelched softly with every step, and my trench coat was soaked straight through to my shirt, heavy and cold against my shoulders. I found a French door leading into what looked like a study or a library. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked tight like a bank vault. Instead, the brass turned with a soft, expensive click, and the door drifted inward on well-oiled hinges, welcoming me into the warmth. Rich people never lock their back doors. They think crime only happens to people reading the morning paper in the rain. I stepped over the threshold into a room lined from floor to ceiling with dark mahogany bookshelves, heavy leather armchairs, and a massive stone fireplace where a few dying embers still glowed a dull, accusing orange. The air inside smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and floor wax. It had a pleasant smell, the kind of smell that made you forget about flophouses on Jackson Street, dead men in cheap suits, and two-fingered men with nickel-plated automatics. I closed the French door behind me, locked it with a quiet turn of the thumb latch, and stood in the shadows of the library for a full minute, listening. The house was dead quiet except for the steady tick-tock of a grandfather clock out in the main hallway and the distant hum of a refrigerator somewhere toward the back of the kitchen. No voices, no footsteps, just the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the leaded glass windows. I crossed the Persian rug silently, keeping the heavy leather briefcase tucked under my arm, and made my way toward the heavy oak door that led out into the central foyer. As I reached for the brass doorknob, I heard a sound from the hallway, a sharp, crisp click of high heels hitting the hardwood floor. I pulled my hand back, stepped behind a tall leather-bound screen that shielded a globe on a stand, and waited. The door to the study opened. Evelyn Thorne stepped into the room. She wasn't wearing her burgundy wool coat or her angled felt hat anymore. She wore a long, flowing house robe made of dark green silk that rustled softly as she moved. Her dark hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in soft waves. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, making her look younger, sharper, and somehow more dangerous than she had across my desk earlier that afternoon. She walked over to the mahogany writing desk near the bay window, reached out, and picked up a silver cigarette case. Her movements were precise, measured, and entirely unhurried. She snapped the case open, pulled out a slender cigarette, and lit it with a heavy brass table lighter. She took a slow, deep drag, exhaling the smoke toward the dark ceiling. Then she spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the silence of the room. "You can come out from behind the screen, Mr. Nile," she said, without turning her head. "You track mud like a stray dog, and you breathe like a man who smokes 3 packs a day too many." I didn't move for a second, then gave a dry, humorless chuckle, stepped out from behind the partition, and walked across the rug until I was standing 10 feet away from her desk. "Next time I'll wipe my feet on the welcome mat," I said, resting my right hand casually near the pocket holding my gun. Though I figured a house with this kind of mortgage wouldn't mind a little honest dirt. Evelyn turned slowly to face me. Her ice green eyes didn't look surprised. They didn't look panicked. They looked cold, calculating, and intensely bored, like a bored cat watching a mouse that had already run out of floor space. "You took your time getting here," she said, leaning her hip against the edge of the desk. "I expected you 3 hours ago. Did you get lost in the slums, or did you stop off for a cheap drink and forget what you were paid for?" "I took a detour," I said, shifting the heavy leather briefcase from under my arm and dropping it squarely onto the center of her pristine mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy metallic thud that made the silver lighter jump an inch. I had to drop by the Barclay Hotel on Jackson Street, room 414, nice view of the brick wall, quiet neighbors, though the guy in the chair wasn't much for conversation. Evelyn's eyes dropped to the briefcase. For a fraction of a second, just a flicker of a shadow across her pupils, the ice green mask cracked. Her jaw tightened, and her hand, holding the cigarette, trembled ever so slightly before she caught herself and locked her fingers into a steady grip. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Mr. Nile," she said smoothly, her voice dropping an octave into a low, controlled register. "I hired you to find Marcus Sterling's ledger. Is that it?" "That's part of it," I said, stepping closer and resting my palms on the edge of the desk, leaning in so I could see every micro-expression on her face. "That's the black book. complete with the payroll kickbacks, the municipal payoffs, and the Zurich bank accounts. But here's the funny thing about timelines, Mrs. Thorne. When you do the math, nothing adds up. She didn't blink. I'm not interested in your arithmetic, Mr. Nile. Take your remaining fee and get out of my house before my husband comes downstairs. Your husband isn't coming downstairs, I said, my voice cutting hard through the room. Richard Thorne is probably sitting in his private study, going over balance sheets or sleeping like a baby, completely unaware that his loving wife just tried to frame him for a murder he didn't commit. Her eyes narrowed to thin green slits. You're losing your mind, detective. Am I? I fired back, ticking the points off on my fingers. Let's look at your timeline, Evelyn. You came into my office at 6 o'clock tonight, looking like $1 million, telling me that Marcus Sterling had been missing for 4 days, since Friday morning, and that he had bolted with $50,000 in company cash and the secret ledger. That is correct, she said, her voice like glass. Except for one tiny little detail, I said, leaning in closer. According to Mickey down at the Rusty Anchor, Sterling was drinking gin in his bar on Friday at midnight. According to Sully the cabbie, Sterling flagged down a hack at 12:30 on Friday night and took a ride down to the King Street station before getting spooked by a black Packard and checking into the Barclay Hotel under an assumed name. I paused, letting the silence hang between us like a loaded clothesline. Now, if Marcus Sterling checked into the Barclay Hotel on Friday night at 1 in the morning, and he stayed there until he caught a bullet through the heart, how did you know he was missing Friday morning, Evelyn? How did you know the safe was empty yesterday evening, which was Sunday, when the man was still alive and breathing in a flophouse across town? The room went dead silent. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked off 2 long, heavy seconds before Evelyn took a slow, deliberate drag of her cigarette. Ash glowed bright red in the dim light of the study. People lie about dates, Mr. Nile, she said, her voice dangerously calm. In business, memory is fluid. Perhaps I got my days confused. Perhaps it was Saturday or Sunday. You didn't get your days confused, I said, shaking my head, because you didn't hear about Sterling's disappearance from a corporate board meeting. You knew where he was because you were the one feeding him instructions. You were the one who told him to take the ledger, go to ground at the Barclay, and play the fugitive while you and Richard restructured the shipping manifests. Evelyn stared at me for a long, hard moment. Then, slowly, a thin, ironic smile touched the corners of her mouth. Not a warm smile, but the smile of a predator who realized the prey had finally stopped running and turned around to bare its teeth. You're smarter than you look, Harry, she said softly, dropping the formal Mr. Nile entirely. I'll give you that. The agency down on 2nd Avenue didn't entirely undersell your talents. And the dead man in the chair? I asked. Who was he? A disgruntled accountant? A dock worker you picked off the street and dressed in an Italian wool suit to play with the corpse? His name was Arthur Pendleton, Evelyn said, walking over to a small mahogany liquor cabinet in the corner of the room. She didn't look nervous anymore. She looked relieved, like a woman who had finally taken off a pair of shoes that were 2 sizes too small. She poured 2 fingers of amber bourbon into a crystal glass without offering me a drop. Arthur was a petty forger and a blackmailer who thought he could squeeze Marcus for $10,000 over some old wartime debts. When Marcus panicked Friday night, he came to us. He begged Richard for help. So you gave him help, I said. You put him in a flophouse, told him to stay put, and then sent a hitman, the 2-fingered man, to clean up the loose ends and leave a decoy body so the police would close the case before anyone looked too closely at the shipping records. Evelyn turned, holding a crystal glass in her hand, leaning against the cabinet. She took a slow sip of the bourbon. Arthur was a liability, Harry. Men like Arthur always are. He wore out his welcome the moment he started making demands. As for the decoy, well, the police needed a body to satisfy the morning papers, and we needed the ledger back where it belongs. It was an efficient solution to a very messy corporate problem. Efficient, I repeated, the word tasting like copper in my mouth. Except one, Evelyn. You didn't just want the ledger back to protect your husband's business. You wanted the ledger because the $50,000 wasn't stolen by Marcus Sterling at all. Richard transferred it into an offshore account in Zurich under your maiden name. Sterling was just the umbrella holding off the storm. Her eyes flashed with genuine anger then, cold, sharp, and lethal. And what do you plan to do with that brilliant deduction, Harry? Run to Detective Frank Rossi? walk into police headquarters and hand over a briefcase full of illegal payoffs involving half the city council and 3 senior judges? Do you really think a drunken private eye with a 3-week-old rent bill is going to take down the entire power structure of Seattle? I don't need to take down the city, I said, standing upright and sliding my hands into my trench coat pockets, my fingers curling around the cold steel of the .38. I just need to walk out of this house with this briefcase, find the real Marcus Sterling before your 2-fingered friend puts another hole in someone's jacket, and let the chips fall where they damn well please. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just raised her glass in a mock toast, her eyes locked on mine with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. "You won't make it to the front gate, Harry," she whispered. At that exact moment, the study door behind me, the heavy oak door leading out to the foyer, swung wide open with a sharp, echoing crack. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I heard the unmistakable sound of a slide racking back on a nickel-plated automatic, and the dry, scraping voice of the 2-fingered man whispered right against the back of my neck. "Drop the coat, Nile," he rasped. "The party's over." The timeline didn't hold, and neither did my luck. Chapter 6. The cold muzzle of the nickel-plated automatic pressed against the base of my skull with the clinical precision of a dentist's drill. It wasn't a hard shove, just a firm, unyielding reminder that physics and bad timing were currently holding all the winning cards. "Drop the coat, Nile," the 2-fingered man rasped again. His breath smelled of stale peppermint and cold iron, drifting over my shoulder like a draft from an open cemetery gate. "And keep your hands right where I can see them. No sudden heroics. Real life isn't a Saturday afternoon cereal, and you ain't wearing a cape." I let my hands slide slowly out of my pockets, keeping my fingers spread wide so he could count every callus and ink stain. The heavy trench coat slumped slightly on my shoulders, weighed down by the wet fabric and the .38 special resting in the pocket. I didn't drop it, though. If I was going to shed my armor, I wanted to pick my own moment. Across the room, Evelyn Thorne didn't flinch. She took another unhurried sip of her bourbon, her ice-green eyes glittering in the soft lamplight like chips of stained glass. She walked around the mahogany desk with the fluid, silent grace of a leopard stepping through high grass, her dark green silk robe rustling against the Persian rug. "I told you, Harry," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any triumph, as if she were simply confirming a routine shipping manifest. "You're a bright man, but you suffer from a terminal lack of imagination. You thought you were walking into a domestic dispute. You thought you were rescuing a damsel in distress from a rogue business partner. You didn't realize that some doors are locked from the inside for a very good reason." "Yeah, well," I muttered, keeping my voice flat to mask the frantic spinning of gears in my head. I always was a slow learner when it came to architectural metaphors. "Next time, I'll stick to chasing stray dogs." The 2-fingered man gave a dry, humorless chuff of air that passed for a laugh behind my ear. He shifted his grip, sliding his mutilated left hand, the hand missing the ring and pinky fingers, down to grab the fabric of my shoulder, spinning me around in one tight, efficient motion. I didn't fight it. I let him turn me, but I kept my eyes locked on his face. Up close, in the harsh light of the study, he looked less like a phantom from the docks and more like a permanent fixture of Seattle's underside. He had a face carved out of old gristle and wet cement, pale skin that had never seen a proper summer, and small dark eyes that had watched too many men crawl out of too many alleyways with their pockets turned inside out. His name wasn't important right now. To me, he was just a collection of walking hazards, a gun, 2 functional fingers on his left hand, and a very bad attitude. "Check his coat, Vince," Evelyn instructed, gesturing toward me with her crystal glass. "Get the piece, and make sure he doesn't have a wire or spare recorder. Men of Mr. Nile's professional persuasion sometimes think they're characters in a dime store detective magazine." Vince, so the 2-fingered man had a name, stepped in close. He kept the automatic leveled at my sternum while his right hand patted down my front. His touch was clinical and fast. He found the .38 special in my right pocket, hooked his thumb around the trigger guard, and slid it out with practiced ease. He tossed the revolver onto the leather armchair behind him without looking down. Then his hand dipped into my inner jacket pocket and came out holding the cream-colored calling card Evelyn had handed me in my office earlier that afternoon, along with my notebook and a half-empty pack of Lucky Strikes. "Nothing else," Vince grunted, his voice like gravel grinding under a boot heel. Just cheap cigarettes and bad poetry. Leave the cigarettes, Evelyn said, walking over to the desk and leaning against the polished wood. She looked down at the heavy leather briefcase sitting squarely in the middle of her paperwork, the black book that held the keys to the city's political throat. He'll need them for the long walk home, or whatever substitute for home a man like Harry has. You're letting me walk? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't believe it for a second. Rich people who build empires on blackmail and municipal kickbacks don't usually hand out parting gifts and bus tokens to private eyes who have their murder plot mapped out on a legal pad. I'm not letting you walk anywhere, Harry, Evelyn said softly, her green eyes locking onto mine with an unblinking chill. Not yet, but you aren't going to the police either. That would be messy, and Richard hates a mess in the newspapers, especially when the municipal elections are only 3 months away. Then what's the play, Evelyn? I asked, shifting my weight slightly, testing the distance between my feet and the edge of the Persian rug. You invite me up to Queen Anne Hill for late-night cocktails and a seminar on corporate ethics? I brought you here because you have something of mine, she said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the brass latch of the leather briefcase. And because you were getting entirely too curious for your own health, but mostly because you stumbled onto a truth that was never meant for the public ledger. The Secret Life of Richard Thorne, I said, glancing toward the dark hallway. Let me guess. The shipping company down on Pier 70 isn't just moving canned salmon and Alaskan timber. It's the primary conduit for every illegal gambling syndicate, narcotics drop, and union payoff between Tacoma and Vancouver. Marcus Sterling wasn't the mastermind. He was just the guy who held the inkwell while Richard signed the checks. Evelyn didn't blink. She took another sip of her bourbon. Marcus was a clerk with delusions of grandeur. He thought because he kept the books he owned the house. When he tried to leverage those records last week to cut himself a bigger slice of the operation, he signed his own eviction notice. Arthur Pendleton, the poor soul you found rotting in room 414, was simply a convenient instrument to make the coroner's report look like a robbery gone wrong, and the 50 grand. A severance package, Evelyn said smoothly, for Marcus, or for anyone else who needed to disappear into the fog. But the ledger itself, that contains the names of men who run this state, governors, judges, police captains, men who make the weather in Seattle. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the room like wood smoke. Including Detective Frank Rossi's superior officers, I added quietly. Which explains why Rossi warned me off the waterfront so fast. He wasn't just protecting me from the mob, he was protecting his own precinct from exploding. Frank is a good soldier, Evelyn said dismissively. He does what he's told, looks the other way when the budget requires it, and drinks cheap coffee at 3 in the morning. He doesn't need to know how the sausage is made. And Vince here? I flicked my eyes toward the two-fingered man standing behind me. Is he a good soldier too? Did he handle the hardware at the Barclay Hotel? Vince didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on my shoulder, his knuckles pressing into my collarbone with enough force to bruise. Vince is a specialist, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a register that had no warmth left in it whatsoever. He handles structural adjustments when things get out of alignment, and right now, Harry, you are severely out of alignment. So what happens now? I asked, keeping my tone light, though my stomach was doing a slow, uneasy dance against my ribs. You lock me in the wine cellar, tie me to a concrete block and drop me off Pier 52 to keep Marcus company? Nothing so dramatic, Evelyn said, standing up straight from the desk. She reached out and snapped the latches of the leather briefcase shut, the sound ringing out like a small pistol shot in the quiet room. We're going to have a little conversation about discretion, Mr. Nile. A professional dialogue between two people who understand how the world actually works. Vince is going to drive us downtown, to your office. I blinked. My office? At 10 o'clock at night? It's not much of a venue for a corporate board meeting, Evelyn. The radiator rattles and the neon sign from the chop suey joint gives everyone a red eye. Your office, she repeated, stepping around the desk and walking toward me until she was standing just a foot away. The scent of gardenia and expensive gin cutting through the smell of my wet wool coat, is where we are going to leave this briefcase. Right on your desk, exactly where a diligent private investigator would find it after cracking the missing persons case. I stared at her, the pieces clicking together with a sickening third. You want to frame me, Not for the murder at the Barclay, not anymore. You want to frame me for possessing the stolen extortion files. You want the police to find the black book in my office so the whole syndicate trail leads straight to a dead broke private eye who can't afford a lawyer, let alone a jury. It's a very clean narrative, Harry, Evelyn said, her eyes calm and utterly devoid of mercy. The police raid your office, find the missing corporate records, and conclude that you tracked down Marcus Sterling, blacked him out for the files, and tried to bleed the company dry. By the time you get out of Walla Walla State Penitentiary, assuming you survive the general population, the statute of limitations on your career will have expired by about 20 years. You really thought this through, didn't you? I muttered, shaking my head. Every loose end tied up in a nice, neat, blood-stained ribbon. In my world, Mr. Nile, you don't survive by leaving loose ends, she said, turning away and walking toward the French doors that led out to the dark terrace. You tie them off, burn the remnants, and move on to the next fiscal quarter. Vince, bring him along, and bring the briefcase. Let's go downtown and close out this case file. Vince gave my shoulder a rough shove, spinning me around toward the door. Move, Nile. And keep your hands where I can see them. I'm looking for an excuse to test out a new silencer, and your ribs look like a fine place to start. I didn't argue. Arguing with a guy missing 2 fingers and an automatic pistol is like trying to convince a hurricane to change direction. I took a slow step toward the hallway, my mind racing through the dark, narrow corridors of my own options. My gun was sitting on the leather armchair behind me. My office was 30 blocks away, and Jolene was sitting right in the middle of the bullseye, waiting for a boss who was currently being marched out of a Queen Anne mansion at gunpoint. We walked out of the study, past the grandfather clock ticking away the seconds in the dark hallway, and toward the heavy oak front door. The rain was still drumming a steady, heavy beat against the roof tiles, turning the night outside into a solid wall of black water. This was the secret life of Seattle, the part they didn't put on the postcards or broadcast over the evening radio serials. Beneath the wet streets, the neon signs, and the polite society of men in tailored suits, the city was built on a foundation of stolen ledgers, cheap blood, and unpunished greed. And right now, I was scheduled to be the cornerstone. Vince nudged me hard in the small of the back with the barrel of his gun, pushing me out into the cold night air as the heavy front door swung shut behind us, locking the warmth, the lies, and the gardenia perfume away in the dark. Chapter 7. The ride downtown in the back of Evelyn Thorne's black Packard was a masterclass in suffocating silence. Vince sat beside me, the nickel-plated automatic tucked firmly into his coat pocket, but his right hand never straying far from the grip. He didn't say a word, didn't move, and didn't even seem to be breathing. He just stared straight ahead through the glass partition at the driver, a thick-necked guy in a chauffeur's cap who looked like he'd been hired for his ability to ignore screams. Evelyn sat on the jump seat opposite us, perfectly composed, clutching her leather purse in her lap, as if she were heading to the opera rather than coordinating a frame-up that would effectively end my life. Outside, the city was a smear of blurred neon and weeping street lamps. The rain had turned into a steady, driving deluge, the kind that turned Seattle into a giant overflowing drainpipe. "You're making a mistake, Evelyn," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the tires on the wet pavement. I was sitting with my hands clasped loosely in my lap, feeling the vibration of the road through the leather seat. Framing a PI is one thing, killing an innocent decoy is another, but bringing me back to my own office to plant the evidence? That's sloppy. That's the kind of work that leaves fingerprints. Evelyn didn't look at me. She kept her gaze fixed on the passing storefronts of the International District. "You give yourself too much credit, Harry. You aren't a target of interest. You're a variable. And in a high-stakes calculation, you're the one that's going to be subtracted from the final sum. The police will find the ledger in your desk, they'll find your fingerprints on the briefcase, and they'll find a motive: greed. A desperate man, drowning in debt, tries to shake down a shipping tycoon and ends up killing his partner when the deal goes sour. It's a story that practically writes itself." "And Jolene?" I asked, my voice tightening. "What happened to my secretary? She's sitting in that office right now, probably expecting me to call. You can't just sweep her under the rug." Evelyn finally turned her head, her ice-green eyes devoid of any human empathy. "Miss Jolene is an unfortunate collateral circumstance. If she's there, she'll be dealt with. If she isn't, she'll be a very interesting witness to your sudden lapse in professional judgment. Either way, she doesn't change the outcome. I felt a cold, hard knot of fury form in my stomach. Jolene was a good kid. She had nothing to do with the shipping rackets or the black market payoffs. She was just a Chicago girl who wanted to make a buck and keep the coffee hot. If Evelyn touched a hair on her head, I'd make it my life's mission to burn the entire Thorne Empire to the ground, even if I had to use my own skin as the fuel. "We're almost there," Vince rasped, his voice sounding like a rusted gate opening on a lonely farm. He tapped the window partition. "Pull around to the alleyway entrance. We don't want to be seen on the main street." The car turned, the tires screeching softly on the wet asphalt as we pulled into the narrow, trash-choked alleyway behind my office building. The neon sign from the chop suey joint across the way flickered, casting a sickly, pulsating red light against the brick walls. It was the same light I'd stared at for 3 years, the same light that had illuminated 100 nights of staring at unpaid bills and empty glasses of rye. The car came to a stop. Vince opened the door and stepped out into the rain, his hand still clamped firmly on my arm. He pulled me out onto the wet pavement, the cold water soaking through my already damp suit instantly. "Move," he commanded, nudging me toward the back fire escape of the building. I started climbing, my feet slipping on the rusted metal rungs. My mind was racing, cataloging every possible exit, every way out of this corner. But the steel stairs were slick. Vince was right behind me with a gun in his hand, and my office was 2 flights up. I reached the landing and pushed open the heavy steel door that led into the back hallway. The building was quiet. The scent of stale grease and industrial floor cleaner was thick in the air. We walked down the hallway, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the linoleum, until we reached the door with the peeling Harry Nile, private investigator letters. I stopped. I didn't want to open that door. I didn't want to see Jolene in the crosshairs of a hitman's gun. "Open it," Vince growled, his thumb checking the safety on his automatic. I reached out and turned the knob. The door swung open to the dimly lit office. The room was dark. The only light came from the red neon sign across the street, painting the office in layers of blood-orange shadow. Jolene wasn't at her desk. The lamp was off, the typewriter was covered, and the chair was empty. "Clear it," Evelyn commanded from the doorway, her voice calm and detached. Vince stepped in, his gun sweeping the room, checking the shadows, the closet, the small inner office where I kept my files. He moved with the precision of a predator in its own den. "Empty," he said, stepping back. Evelyn entered the room, her silk robe rustling. She headed straight for my desk, took the briefcase from Vince, and set it down firmly on the blotter. She started opening the drawers, looking for a place to hide the ledgers, her movements efficient and cold. "Now," she said, looking at me. "The script says you sit in that chair, you reach for the phone to call the cops, and then you take the fall." I looked at the desk, then the floor. My eyes caught something, a small detail, something that hadn't been there when I left for Barclay. On the floor, right near the edge of the radiator, was a half-smoked cigarette butt, a brand I didn't smoke, a filter-tipped Pall Mall. I didn't smoke Pall Malls. The Barclay Hotel night clerk smoked Pall Malls. My heart skipped a beat. The night clerk. The man with the apricot-colored thumbs and the wire-rimmed glasses held together with electrical tape. He wasn't just a hotel clerk. He had been here. He had been in my office when I was at Barclay. Why? My eyes darted to the desk. The top drawer was slightly askew. Not much, maybe a quarter of an inch, but I kept that drawer shut tight enough to squeeze a dollar bill. "Is there a problem, Mr. Nile?" Evelyn asked, noticing my gaze. "I'm just thinking about the irony," I said, my voice steadying. "You come here to frame me for stealing this book, but you didn't even check to see what was inside it." Evelyn arched a perfectly groomed eyebrow. "The ledger is exactly what Marcus stole from the company. I don't need to verify the contents of my own property." "Are you sure?" I stepped toward the desk. "You might want to double-check the pagination." Marcus wasn't a fool. He knew he was being played. He didn't just walk out with the original ledger. He walked out with a copy. And the real ledger, the one that lists the accounts held in your name, Evelyn, that one has been moving around the city like a hot potato for the last 6 hours. Evelyn paused, her hand hovering over the latch of the briefcase. The look in her eyes wasn't just cold anymore. It was flickering with doubt. The confidence that had carried her through the mansion was starting to fray at the edges. "You're lying," she said. "Am I?" I leaned down, my fingers hovering near the edge of my own desk, feeling for the hidden spring under the wood. Open it and see. Check the last 3 pages. Look for the account under E. Thorne. Go ahead, it's your book. Evelyn hesitated. She looked at the briefcase, then me, then Vince. Vince, she barked. Open it. Vince stepped forward, his gun still trained on my chest, and reached out with his left hand to unlatch the briefcase. That was the detail that won't die. The left hand. The hand with the missing fingers. As his hand moved, I dropped to the floor, grabbing the edge of the heavy oak desk and pulling it toward me with every ounce of strength in my legs. The desk groaned, shifting across the linoleum, and crashed into Vince's knees, throwing him off balance just as he reached for the latch. The automatic fired, the round tearing through the ceiling and showering the room in plaster dust. I scrambled to the side, lunging for the leather armchair where Vince had tossed my .38 special earlier. My fingers brushed the cool steel of the handle just as Vince recovered, his face twisted into a mask of pure murderous rage. He lunged for me, but I was already turning, pulling the trigger. The .38 roared in the small enclosed space, the sound deafening, rattling the windows in their frames. The shot hit Vince square in the shoulder, spinning him around and knocking the nickel-plated automatic out of his hand. It skittered across the floor, sliding under the radiator. Vince screamed, clutching his shoulder, and hit the floor hard. Evelyn was already moving for the door, her face a mask of panic, but I wasn't letting her go. I surged to my feet, kicked the briefcase off the desk so it landed between us, and leveled the .38 at her chest. Hold it right there, Mrs. Thorne, I said, my voice shaking with a mix of adrenaline and righteous fury. The performance is over. You're losing the lead role, and the theater is about to be raided. Evelyn stopped, her back to the door, her green eyes wide with genuine fear for the first time. The mask was completely gone. You can't do this, she hissed. You're nothing, nobody. Maybe, I said, cocking the hammer of the .38. But I'm the guy who's going to make sure your husband's ledger ends up in a place where it can't be bought, buried, or framed. And you're going to be the main attraction at the precinct house when Rossi realizes that the body at the Barclay is the only thing that's going to clear his own name. I looked at the phone on my desk. I knew who I had to call. And I knew that when the sirens started screaming down on the street, this whole rotten, rain-slicked city was going to start to unravel. The detail that won't die, the truth about who owned the ledgers, who held the guns, and who actually ran the shipping docks, was finally coming to light. And for the first time in my career, I was the one holding the spotlight. I reached for the phone, my finger hovering over the dial, and dialed the number for the precinct. The game was up. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the law to show up and do the job I'd been paid to do. Case closed. Nothing really fixed, but at least the balance was about to be reset. Chapter 8. The silence that followed the gunshot was heavy, thick, and smelled of ozone. Vince was on the floor, curled around his ruined shoulder, cursing in a language that sounded like a blender full of broken glass. Evelyn stood by the door, her composure shattered like a dropped whiskey glass, her eyes darting between me, the gun, and the briefcase that sat mockingly on the scuffed linoleum. The red neon light from the chop suey joint continued to pulse rhythmically, painting the room in alternating shades of crime scene orange and cold, dead shadow. I kept the .38 pointed steady at her chest, my finger taking up the slack on the trigger. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands, for once, were rock solid. Don't move, Evelyn, I said, my voice dropping into that low, dangerous register I usually reserved for debt collectors and aggressive landlords. The next sound in this room is going to be the sirens, and I'd hate for you to be holding a weapon when the boys in blue kick that door in. You think they'll believe you? She spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and mounting terror. You're a private investigator with a record of assault, a history of drinking on the job, and an office that hasn't seen a legitimate client in 3 months. I am the wife of Richard Thorne. My word is worth 1,000 of yours in any courtroom in Seattle. Maybe, I said, stepping over the briefcase and closing the distance between us. But you're forgetting one thing. I'm not playing by the court rules. I'm playing by the rules of the street. And on the street, dead men tell no tales, but their ledgers scream at the top of their lungs. I leaned down, scooped up the briefcase with my left hand, and dumped it onto the desk, flipping the latches open. I grabbed the first stack of papers, the ones I'd already scanned. the ones listing the municipal payoffs, and shoved them into the inner pocket of my trench coat. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I'm balancing the books," I said. "The police can have the rest. The incriminating stuff, the names, the accounts, the dates, that's staying with me until I can hand it over to a prosecutor who doesn't have his mortgage paid by Thorn Shipping." "You'll never leave this building," she whispered. "Wanna bet?" I stepped back, keeping the gun leveled, and moved toward the desk lamp. I clicked it on, flooding the room with a harsh, unflattering yellow light. I snatched up the phone receiver, dialed the direct line to the precinct, and waited. Ring, ring, ring. "Rossi," a tired voice answered on the other end. It was Frank. He sounded like he'd been awake for 48 hours and had spent at least 30 of them getting screamed at by his captain. "Nile, if you're calling to tell me you found the dog, I'm going to hang up and file a complaint for harassment." "It's not the dog, Frank," I said, watching Evelyn's face pale in the light. "I've got the briefcase, I've got the accomplice, the two-fingered man, and I've got the mastermind. They're sitting in my office on 2nd Avenue, room 402. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear Frank take a deep, steadying breath. "You're in the office, Harry?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp, devoid of fatigue. "I'm in the office," I confirmed. "And I'm holding a smoking gun, a bleeding hitman, and the wife of the city's biggest racketeer. You better get over here before I run out of patience, or before someone else decides they want to rewrite the ending of this story. Don't you move, Harry." "Don't you dare move," Frank said. Then the line went dead. I hung up the phone and looked at Evelyn. She was standing perfectly still now, her eyes fixed on the door, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. She knew the game was up. She knew the moment Rossi arrived, the carefully constructed facade of the Thorn Empire would start to crack, and she'd be the first one buried under the debris. "You're a fool, Harry," she said, her voice quiet, almost mournful. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? You haven't just exposed a shipping company. You've ripped the structural pillars out from under this entire city. There won't be a trial. There will be no headline in the paper. There will just be an accident, a car crash, a fire, a slip on a wet pier. You've guaranteed your own death." "I've been dead for years, Evelyn," I said, pulling a cigarette from my pack and lighting it with a steady hand. "I just haven't had the decency to lie down yet." I walked over to the closet, grabbed a piece of heavy-duty twine I kept for packing evidence, and tossed it toward her. "Tie him up," I commanded, gesturing toward Vince. "I will do no such thing," she snapped. "Tie him up, or I pull the trigger and let you explain to the cops why there's a hitman bleeding out on my floor and a society dame standing over him with a smoking gun," I said, my voice cold as the rain outside. She looked at me, saw I wasn't bluffing, and slowly picked up the twine. She walked over to Vince, who was still groaning and clutching his shoulder, and began binding his hands behind his back. She did it with a strange clinical detachment, as if she were tying up a parcel rather than a man who had done her dirty work for years. I watched her, the .38 special still loosely aimed at her back. This was the setup, radio drama's final act. All that remained was the walkout. The sound of sirens began to bleed into the room, a distant, mournful wail that grew louder and more insistent, cutting through the heavy, wet air of the Seattle night. Blue and red lights began to sweep across the office walls, dancing with the red neon of the chop suey sign, turning the room into a frantic, dizzying disco of impending justice. "It's over, Evelyn," I said, walking to the window and pulling back the heavy, dust-caked curtain. Down on the street, 2 squad cars were pulling up to the curb, their lights washing the building in a chaotic, rhythmic glare. I watched as the doors swung open, and Frank Rossi emerged, his coat collar turned up against the rain, his service revolver drawn and ready. Behind him, 2 uniformed cops were scrambling out, their hands on their holsters. I stepped back from the window and turned to look at the room. It looked like a set piece for a murder mystery. The blood on the floor, the briefcase on the desk, the woman standing over the bound hitman. It was perfect. I looked at the briefcase one last time. It had all the answers, but it hadn't solved a thing. The shipping racket would just find a new frontman. Corruption would simply move to a new set of ledgers. The rain would keep falling, and the city would keep on rot, hidden beneath the surface of polite society and well-kept suburban lawns. "You think you've won," Evelyn said, her voice a low, bitter rasp. but you've just cleared the board for the next player. Richard will never let this reach the light of day. He'll bury you, me, and that folder in your pocket before the sun comes up." "Maybe," I said, as the heavy thud of footsteps began to hammer up the stairs toward my door. "But for one night at least, the ledger is balanced. And that's about as much as a guy like me can hope for." I walked to my desk, grabbed my fedora, and jammed it onto my head. I looked at the briefcase, then the .38 in my hand. I dropped the gun onto the desk, next to the ledgers. The door to my office burst open. Rossi stood there, his gun aimed at the center of the room, his eyes scanning the chaos. He saw the briefcase. He saw Evelyn. He saw Vince tied up on the floor. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a second there was a flash of something: respect, regret, or maybe just the recognition of two old soldiers who were tired of fighting a war they couldn't win. "You're a real piece of work, Nile," Rossi said, holstering his weapon. "I do my best, Frank," I replied, grabbing my trench coat from the hat rack. "The evidence is on the desk. The hitman is yours, and the lady, she's all yours." I walked past them. I walked past the shocked, staring faces of the uniformed cops. I walked out of my office, down the groaning, creaking stairs, and out into the biting, wet embrace of the Seattle night. The rain hit me like a physical weight, cold and unforgiving. I turned up my collar, shoved my hands into my pockets, and started walking. I didn't look back. I didn't stop for a drink. I just kept walking until the sound of the sirens was swallowed by the relentless, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the pavement. The case was closed. But as I turned the corner and headed toward the dark, lonely stretch of the waterfront, I knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow the rain would still be there, and so would I. Nothing had changed, but one night the ledger had been balanced, and that was enough. Chapter 9. The precinct house was a sprawling, brutalist monument to municipal fatigue, smelling of wet asphalt, floor wax, and the kind of stale coffee that could strip the paint off a patrol car. By the time I walked through the main doors, my coat was dripping a small pond onto the checkered linoleum, and my head felt like it had been used as a punching bag for a heavyweight contender. The precinct was in an uproar. Phones were ringing off the hooks, typewriters were clattering in a frantic, disjointed symphony, and detectives were running back and forth with files clutched to their chests like they were shields. I didn't head for the front desk. I knew the way. I walked straight past the duty sergeant, who didn't even look up from his stack of incident reports, and down the narrow, dimly lit corridor that led to the interrogation wing. Frank Rossi was waiting for me outside interview room B. He had his hat in his hand, his hair was disheveled, and he looked like he'd aged 5 years since we stood in my office. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't yelling, he was just looking at me with a tired, hollow expression that said more than 1,000 questions could. "They're inside," he said, nodding toward the heavy, opaque glass of the door. "Evelyn in B, the two-fingered guy, Vince in C. We've got forensics tearing your office apart for the rest of the evidence, and the DA is already on his way down here, looking like he's about to have a coronary." "Did you look at the ledger?" I asked, lighting a cigarette and leaning against the peeling green paint of the hallway wall. My hands were finally starting to settle, though the adrenaline was still humming in my veins like a faulty electrical circuit. Rossi took a long, slow drag of his cigarette, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. I looked. I wish I hadn't. "It's all there, Harry. Every payoff, every bribe, every dirty deal from here to the docks. It's enough to burn half the administration to the ground, and that includes the man who signs my paycheck. So what now?" I blew a thin stream of gray smoke toward the high, barred windows. "Do you bury it? Send it to the archives where the rats can chew on the evidence until it's nothing but pulp?" Rossi looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. "The DA is decent, Harry, but he's a politician. If I pass this, it's going to turn into a circus. The defense attorneys will call it tainted, the judges will declare it inadmissible, and the Thorns will walk away with a slap on the wrist and a bigger bank account. You know that. I know that." "Then you don't hand it over to the DA," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the folded stack of papers I'd taken from the briefcase before Rossi arrived. I held them out to him. "You hand this to the papers, the Seattle Times, the front page, morning edition. You blast it into the light, Frank. You make it so public that even a judge with a pocket full of Thorn money can't ignore the facts." Rossi stared at the papers in my hand. He didn't reach for them. He knew exactly what he was looking at: the death warrant for his career, his pension, and probably his peace of mind. "You're asking me to commit career suicide, Harry," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I'm asking you to be the man I thought you were back in the jungle," I said, pushing the papers toward his chest. "We didn't bleed on that island so a bunch of fat cats could turn Seattle into their private playground. You want to save this city? This is how you do it. You don't play by their rules, because their rules are rigged. You blow the whole thing wide open." Rossi hesitated for a heartbeat, a long, agonizing second where the fate of half the city seemed to hang in the balance. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the papers. His fingers were steady. He tucked them inside his jacket, right next to his heart, and buttoned the coat up tight. "If I do this," he said, his voice firming up, "you aren't going to be involved. You weren't here. You didn't give me these. You just lost the briefcase in the scuffle at your office. You're clear, Harry. You're just a private detective who happened to solve a missing person case and stumbled into a hornet's nest. Capiche?" "I was never here," I agreed, a faint, cynical smile touching my lips. "I'm just a guy with a bad suit and a lot of unpaid bills." "Go home, Harry," Rossi said, turning toward the door. "Get some sleep. You're going to need it when the fallout hits the fan tomorrow morning." I didn't argue. I turned and walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing against the linoleum. I stopped by the interrogation room door and glanced inside through the narrow, reinforced glass. Evelyn Thorne was sitting at the metal table, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of cold, unyielding pride. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a queen waiting for her subjects to apologize for the inconvenience. She didn't see me, but even if she had, I doubt she would have cared. She was already calculating the cost of the lawyers, the bribe money, and the inevitable fallout. She thought she was untouchable, and maybe in her world she was. But one night, the ledger had been opened, the secrets had been spilled, and the truth had been given a fighting chance. I pushed through the precinct doors and stepped out into the night. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the cool, watery glow of the moon. The air was crisp, cold, and clean, the first clean breath I'd had in a week. I started walking toward my apartment on the edge of the International District. My shoes felt heavy, my clothes were damp, and I had the worst headache of my life, but I felt strangely light. The case was closed. The decoy body in room 414 was being shipped to the coroner. The two-fingered man, Vince, was behind bars, and the biggest extortion file in the history of the Pacific Northwest was currently resting inside the jacket pocket of the only honest cop left in the city. As I walked past the darkened storefronts, the shadows seemed a little less menacing. The neon signs flickered with a rhythm that felt almost musical, and the city, for all its grime and rot, felt like a place worth fighting for, if only for the sake of the next guy who walked through my door with a story that didn't add up. I turned the corner toward my block and saw a familiar sight. Jolene was standing outside the entrance to my building, huddled in a wool coat, clutching her handbag to her chest. She had the look of someone who'd been waiting for a long time, her eyes scanning the street with a mixture of anxiety and relief. When she saw me, she let out a long, ragged breath and walked toward me, her heels clicking against the wet sidewalk. "Harry," she said, her voice soft. "I saw the police cars down at the office. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know if you were okay." "I'm fine, Joe," I said, stopping in front of her. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes, and found one last cigarette. I lit it, the cherry glowing brightly in the dark. It was just a long night, a very long night. "Did you find it?" she asked, looking at my empty hands. "The book? The money?" "I found it," I said, exhaling a long, thin stream of smoke toward the stars. "And I lost it, all of it." Jolene looked at me, studying my face, searching for the joke, the lie, or the regret. She found none of those things. She found only the weariness of a man who had done what he had to do and had no interest in explaining why. "You're an idiot, Harry Nile," she said, though there was no malice in her voice, just a quiet, resigned affection. "You had $50,000 in your hands, and you let it go. $50,000 doesn't buy you a good night's sleep in this city, Joe," I said, putting my arm around her shoulder and guiding her toward the entrance of the building. "But a clear conscience, even one as bruised and battered as mine, is worth its weight in gold." "We're going to be evicted, aren't we?" she asked, a faint, tired smile on her lips. "Probably," I said, opening the door. But that's a problem for tomorrow morning. Tonight, I think we've earned a drink, a real drink. Not that cheap, rot-gut rye, something decent. We can't afford decent, she reminded me. Then we'll drink it on credit, I said, leading her inside. Tomorrow, the city is going to wake up to a different set of headlines. Tomorrow, the whole world is going to be different. But tonight, the rain has stopped, and that's enough for me. We walked up the stairs, the building creaking and groaning in the quiet night. As I climbed the final step to my floor, I looked back one last time at the dark, wet street below. The city was still there, vast and indifferent, churning with its hidden debts and its uncounted sins. But for now, the ledger was balanced, the accounts were closed, and the long, cold walk into the night had finally come to an end. I walked into my office, sat down at my desk, and stared at the empty space where the briefcase had been. It felt lighter now. Everything felt lighter. I reached out, clicked on the lamp, and looked at the stack of unpaid bills on the side of the desk. They were still there, still waiting for their due date, but I didn't care. I pulled a clean sheet of paper from the drawer, uncapped my pen, and wrote down a few lines. Not for a client, not for a report, not for a case file, just for me. A reminder of why I did what I did, and why I would do it again if I had to. Then I closed the drawer, turned off the lamp, and leaned back in my chair. The city was quiet. The rain was gone. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise that tomorrow was another day, another case, another chance to do the right thing, or at least to do the best I could, which was usually all the luck a guy like Harry Nile ever got. I leaned my head back, closed my eyes, and let the quiet take me. The case was closed. Nothing really fixed, but the balance was set, and the night was mine to keep. Chapter 10. The morning sun didn't rise so much as it bled over the horizon, a bruised purple light that strained through the thick, low-hanging clouds of a Seattle dawn. It was the kind of morning that made you want to pull the curtains tight and wait for the world to apologize for existing. I was sitting at my desk, a cup of lukewarm, sludge-thick coffee in one hand and the morning edition of the Seattle Times spread out before me. There it was, right above the fold. SAP magnate's wife arrested in extortion plot. Ledger reveals citywide corruption. The headline wasn't just big. It was loud. It was the kind of story that didn't just sell papers. It shuttered administrations and forced honest men to find new lines of work. Below it, a black and white photograph of Evelyn Thorne being escorted into the precinct house, her silk robe long gone, replaced by a drab, oversized coat, her hair disheveled, but her head still held high with that same terrifying aristocratic arrogance. The story quoted anonymous sources within the police department, describing the recovery of a black ledger that documented years of illegal payoffs to port authorities, labor union bosses, and city council members. It was a beautiful, devastating piece of journalism. Frank Rossi had done his job. He'd blown the doors off the hinges, and the sunlight was now scouring the rot out of the foundation. "You look like you're reading your own obituary," Jolene said, walking into the room with a stack of mail in her hand. She stopped, looked at the paper, and let out a long, low whistle. "Well, I guess the rent's covered for at least another month, assuming the building doesn't get seized by the state for harboring a criminal enterprise." "It's a start," I said, folding the paper and pushing it aside. The coffee tasted like battery acid, but it was hot, and that was enough. "They're calling you the anonymous tipster on the radio," she continued, setting the mail down on the desk. "Some of the morning commentators are calling you a hero. The others are calling you a dangerous vigilante who's destabilizing the local economy. You're becoming a regular topic of conversation, Harry." "I'd prefer to be a footnote," I said. "Heroes have short lifespans and terrible insurance policies. I just want to be the guy who clears the ledger and goes home to a decent night's sleep." The phone rang. It was a sharp, demanding sound that cut through the quiet morning. I looked at it for a moment, then reached out and lifted the receiver. "Nile," I said. "It's Rossi." The voice on the other end was clipped, tired, and sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "I hope you're happy, Harry. The DA is screaming for my head. The captain is in a meeting with the mayor, and I've got 3 different reporters camped out in my living room demanding an interview. The whole department is in a state of absolute, unmitigated chaos." "I told you it would be a circus, Frank," I said, leaning back in my creaking chair. It's not a circus, it's a firestorm, Rossi corrected. But here's the kicker. Evelyn Thorne isn't talking. She's sitting in that holding cell like she's waiting for her lunch to be served, refusing to say a word to anyone but her lawyers. But the two-fingered man, Vince, he cracked. After a few hours of persuasion in the back room, he sang like a canary. He spilled everything: the Barclay Hotel, the Arthur Pendleton setup, the offshore accounts. He even told them about the warehouse on the docks where the real Marcus Sterling had been stashed before he managed to bribe his way onto a freighter headed for Manila. So, the real Sterling is gone? Miles away by now, Rossi said. But he doesn't matter. We've got enough on Evelyn and Richard to keep them in court for the next 10 years. The city councilmen are already trying to cut deals, and the union bosses are disappearing into the woodwork faster than you can say indictment. And what about you, Frank? I asked. Are you going to be okay? I'm keeping my head down, he said, his voice softening slightly. They can't fire me. I've got too much on the captain, and he knows it. For now, I'm just going to keep doing the job, one day at a time. It's the best a guy like me can hope for. Stay safe, Frank. You too, Harry. And for God's sake, keep your office door locked. You've made a lot of powerful enemies in the last 24 hours. They don't take being embarrassed lightly. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The rain had started again, a light, persistent drizzle that smeared the city into a gray, watercolor mess. It was the same Seattle as it had been yesterday, the same wet streets, the same broken neon signs, the same underlying current of greed and human failing. But as I watched the people below scurrying beneath their umbrellas, they looked a little less like victims and a little more like people just trying to get through the day. The front door opened. I didn't expect a visitor. Not after the headlines, but in walked a man in a rumpled tan trench coat, holding a damp fedora in his hands. He looked to be in his late 50s, with a face that had seen a lot of hard miles, and eyes that held the quiet, weary intelligence of a man who'd spent his life looking for answers. He didn't look like a client. He didn't look like a cop. He looked like a man who was used to standing in the rain. "Harry Nile?" he asked. "That's what it says on the door," I said, standing up and motioning toward the chair. "Take a seat, or don't. But you better have a good reason for coming here. I'm currently the most popular man in the city, and that's not necessarily a promotion." The man sat down, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed his fedora on his lap and looked around the office with a faint, appreciative smile. "I've read the papers," he said. "You did good, Harry. A hard thing. Most men in your position would have taken the briefcase, taken the payoff, and walked away into the sunset. You chose to burn the bridge instead." "I don't like being played," I said, my voice flat. "And I don't like being the punchline to someone else's joke." "A man who doesn't like being played is a man who can be trusted," the stranger said. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, and tossed it onto the desk. "My name is Silas Vance. I'm a special prosecutor for the state. I've been building a case against the Thorne organization for 3 years, and I've been hitting a brick wall at every turn. Until this morning." I looked at the notebook, then back at him. "So why come to me?" "Because," Silas said, leaning forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "The Thorne organization is just the tip of the iceberg. There are others, larger operations, deeper roots, more influence. And they aren't going to just go away because you put Evelyn Thorne in a jail cell. They're going to be looking for someone to blame for the instability, someone to make an example of." "Are you offering me a job?" I asked, my voice laced with skepticism. "I'm offering you a partnership," Silas said. "I have the law, resources, and powers. You have the street-level knowledge, the connections, and the one thing that no one else in this city possesses, a lack of fear. Together, we could dismantle the entire infrastructure of the racket that's been bleeding this city dry for the last decade." I looked at the notebook, then at the headline on the desk. I looked at Jolene, who was watching us from the corner, her face a mixture of concern and hope. "I'm a private investigator, Silas," I said, picking up the cigarette butt and stubbing it out in the overflowing ashtray. "I find missing people, I uncover cheating spouses, and I keep my nose out of matters of the state. I don't do crusades. I don't do political revolutions." "Then do it for the city," Silas said, standing up. "Do it for the people who don't have the voice to scream when the floor is ripped out from under them. Do it because if you don't, The next person who walks through that door might not be as lucky as you were last night." He turned and walked toward the door, leaving the notebook on the desk. "I'll be at the state office on 4th Avenue, he called back over his shoulder. "Think about it, Harry. And while you're at it, think about what kind of city you want to live in." He walked out, the door clicking shut behind him with a final echoing sound. I sat there for a long time, the notebook sitting on my desk like a ticking clock. I thought about the man in the chair at the Barclay. I thought about Evelyn Thorne's cold ice-green eyes. I thought about Rossi and the look on his face when he took the files. I looked at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. "Are you going to do it?" Jolene asked, walking over to the desk and looking down at the notebook. I reached out, picked up the notebook, and held it in my hands. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. "I don't know, Joe," I said, a faint, tired smile touching my lips. "But I think I'm done with simple cases. I think I'm done with the easy answers." I stood up, grabbed my coat from the hat rack, and pulled my fedora down low over my eyes. I looked out the window one last time at the city, at the rain, at the wet streets, at the people moving beneath the gray, uncaring sky. The case was closed, but the story was far from over. And as I stepped out of the office and started the long walk down the stairs, I knew that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just walking into the rain. I was walking toward the storm. I stepped out onto the street, the cold air hitting me like a challenge, and started walking. The ledger was balanced, the accounts were closed, and the world was waiting to see what I'd do next. It was a hell of a morning to be a private investigator in Seattle, and I had a feeling it was only going to get colder from here. But as I turned the corner and headed toward 4th Avenue, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in a long time, I knew exactly who I was and exactly what I had to do. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, washing the grime into the gutters, and in the middle of it all, a man in a trench coat kept walking, his eyes fixed on the horizon, ready for whatever lay ahead. The crook had cracked, the truth was out, and the game had only just begun. I lit another cigarette, let the smoke mix with the damp air, and kept moving. Case closed. Nothing really fixed, not yet. But the ledger was balanced, and tonight I'll sleep just fine. Chapter 11. The office felt different now. The air, usually heavy with the scent of stale tobacco and the lingering dust of forgotten files, seemed lighter, almost sterile. I stood by the frosted glass door, looking at the backward print of my own name, Harry Nile, private investigator, and wondered when the eye had finally finished peeling away. It was gone now, a jagged scar on the glass, leaving only a ghost of who I was supposed to be. Jolene was sitting at her desk, methodically cleaning the keys of the old Underwood typewriter. She didn't look up when I gathered my things. She didn't need to. She knew the rhythm of the office, the way the air shifted when a case was truly over and the client wasn't coming back. "Are you leaving the notebook?" she asked, her voice quiet, the clack, clack, clack of the keys providing the only beat. I glanced at the desk where Silas Vance's ledger sat, a black leather-bound weight that pulled at the center of gravity in the room. I had been staring at it for an hour, contemplating the sheer, terrifying geometry of what it represented. It wasn't just a collection of crimes, it was a blueprint for an entire architecture of rot. If I took it, I was signing up for a war that didn't have a clear battlefield, a war where the enemy didn't wear uniforms and the weapons were made of ink, influence, and indifference. If I left it, I was just a guy with a drinking problem who got lucky once. "I'm leaving the notebook," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the small space. "I'm not a special prosecutor, and I'm not a revolutionary. I'm a guy who finds things. The city can find its own way out of the dark." I threw my last few belongings into the battered leather satchel I'd carried since the war. A spare snub-nosed .38, a half-empty bottle of rye, a few dog-eared books I'd been meaning to finish, and the faded photograph of a woman whose name I barely remembered. I didn't need the ledger to know who I was. I walked over to the desk, picked up the notebook, and dropped it into the wastebasket, burying it beneath a mountain of junk mail and crumpled receipts. It was the most honest thing I'd ever done with a piece of evidence. "Are you sure about that?" Jolene asked, finally stopping the typewriter. She looked at me, her eyes sharp, intelligent, and entirely unimpressed by my sudden moral clarity. "I'm sure," I said, turning toward the door. If Vance wants to burn down the city, he can be the one to light the match. I'm just going to try to stay dry. I walked out of the office, the hinges giving one last agonizing screech as I pulled the door shut behind me. The hallway was dark, the amber bulb still buzzing with that rhythmic, dying hum. I walked down the stairs, every step a memory of a time when I thought this job meant something more than just managing the debris of other people's lives. When I hit the street, the rain had finally, mercifully stopped. The clouds were breaking up, showing a thin, pale strip of sky that held the promise of a morning that wasn't entirely gray. The air was cold, bracing, and smelled of the coming autumn. It was the kind of air that made you feel like you were standing on the edge of something, not a cliff exactly, but a threshold. I turned up my collar, shoved my hands into my pockets, and started walking toward the waterfront. I didn't have a destination, I didn't have a client, I didn't have a debt, or a lead, or a shadow following me down the narrow, rain-slicked alleys. I was just a man in a wet trench coat, walking through the city I called home, listening to the quiet thrum of a world that didn't know how close it had come to burning down. As I neared the piers, the smell of the Sound became absolute, brine, diesel, and the deep, eternal saltiness of the Pacific. I watched the water, black and churning against the pilings. I thought about Marcus Sterling, wherever he was, and Evelyn Thorne, currently cooling her heels in a cell while her lawyers argued about the legality of the ledger. I thought about Rossi standing in his precinct, wondering if the front-page news would be the end of him or the beginning of something else. It all felt so distant now, a lifetime away. I reached Pier 52 and stopped by the spot where Sully usually parked his cab. The space was empty, just a patch of oily, rain-soaked wood and a discarded wrapper from a candy bar. I lit a lucky strike, the flare of the match lighting up the dark, and let the smoke drift away into the salt air. "Looking for a ride, Harry?" I turned around. Sully was leaning against a piling a few yards away, his pipe clenched between his teeth, his face a map of wrinkles and wisdom. "Just looking for some air," I said, flicking the match into the water. "Heard about the Thorne business," Sully said, nodding toward the city behind us. "Big news. Everyone's talking about it. They say a mysterious informant blew the lid off the whole thing. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "I'm just a guy who drives a Plymouth and drinks cheap rye, Sully," I said, a faint smile touching my lips. "I don't know anything about mysterious informants. Sounds like a character from a radio play." Sully laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Yeah, maybe. But you look different, Harry. You look like a guy who just woke up from a long, bad dream." "Maybe I did," I said, turning back toward the water. "Are you going to keep working down here?" Sully asked. "I don't know," I said. "I think maybe I'll take a few days. Maybe walk the docks. Maybe head out toward the Sound and see if the fish are biting. I think I've had enough ledgers and secret lives for a while." "Smart move," Sully said, returning to his cab. "The rain's going to hold off for a few hours. Best enjoy it while it lasts." He climbed into his hack and drove off, the yellow paint fading into the gray mist until he was nothing more than a memory of a cab light in the dark. I stood there for a long time, watching the tide go out. I felt the weight of the last few days lifting, evaporating like the fog off the bay. The city was still there, a sprawling, hungry beast that would keep on eating and keep on feeding, but I was outside of it now. I wasn't the guy with the gun, or the guy with the book, or the guy holding the spotlight. I was just me, and that was enough. I walked along the waterfront, past the warehouses, past the rusted iron of the cranes, past the silent hulking ships that were waiting for the tide to turn. The world seemed vast, indifferent, and infinitely beautiful in its own broken, decaying way. I didn't need to fix it. I didn't need to balance the ledger. I just needed to walk through it, one day at a time, until the sun finally broke through the clouds. As I reached the end of the pier, I stopped. I looked back at the city, at the skyline, jagged and proud against the morning sky, at the life I'd built out of broken pieces and half-truths. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the gold cigarette case Evelyn had left behind in my office, a small, heavy, ornate thing I'd somehow managed to pocket in the chaos of the night, and tossed it into the black water. It made a small, clean plink as it hit the surface, then was gone, swallowed by the deep, cold indifference of the sea. I was empty-handed. I had nothing to show for the last 4 days except a pair of wet shoes, a lingering headache, and a memory that I was probably going to be nursing for the rest of my life. But I was free. I turned away from the water and started walking back toward the center of town. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for a lead. I wasn't waiting for a client. I was just walking. And the air, for all its chill, felt like a clean slate. The city was waking up now. The streetcars were starting to rumble along their tracks. The newspapers were hitting the stands, and the people were beginning their daily shuffle toward the jobs that would keep them alive. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a man in a fedora and a trench coat was just another shadow in the morning light. I reached the corner of 4th and Pike, pulled my hat down a little lower, and kept moving. The case was closed. Nothing really fixed. The world was still broken, and the rain was probably only a few hours away. But the ledger was balanced, and the night was finally, truly over. I walked into the stream of humanity, lost in the noise and the rhythm of the city, feeling the steady, unrelenting pull of the future. I had no case, I had no clients, I had no plan, and it was the best feeling. I passed a coffee shop where a radio was playing a slow, mournful jazz tune, something about lost love and rain-slicked streets. I stopped, listened for a second, then continued. The song ended. The announcer's voice crackled through the static, and the city hummed along, indifferent to the man who had almost burned it down. I kept walking, my footsteps steady on the pavement, my mind clear of the clutter of secret lives and hidden sins. I was Harry Nile, and I was still standing. And as the city began to roar to life around me, I knew that no matter what happened next, no matter how hard the rain came down, I'd be ready. I was done with the shadows. It was time to step into the light, even if it only lasted a minute. I took one last look at the office building down the street, the place where I'd spent so many long, lonely nights, and then I turned the corner and disappeared into the crowd. The case was closed, and this time I meant it. I kept walking, step after steady step, until the city swallowed me whole, a single solitary shadow in the heart of the morning. I was free, and that was the only truth. I adjusted my collar against the wind, felt the dampness of the morning on my face, and kept moving, one step, then 2, then 100, until the sound of my own footsteps was lost in the vast, beautiful, indifferent roar of Seattle waking up. I was home, I was alive, and for now, that was enough. Case closed. No leads, no shadows, no ledgers, just the road ahead, and the infinite open promise of a day that was entirely my own to write. I pulled my fedora down, lit one last lucky strike, and walked on, leaving the past behind, one foot in front of the other, into the quiet, uncertain, and beautiful light of a brand new day.